The courtroom was a familiar, sterile place, with its high ceilings and rows of uncomfortable wooden benches. But today, something felt different. The air was heavy, thick with anticipation, as if everyone in the room knew they were about to witness something extraordinary. The judge, a young man with a sharp jaw and piercing eyes, glanced around the room, his gaze stopping momentarily on the elderly man standing before him. His name was Sam Green, an old man with silver hair, hunched shoulders, and a demeanor that screamed weakness. The kind of person no one would ever expect to be capable of anything extraordinary. "Mr. Green," the judge's voice cut through the silence, "you stand accused of fraud and embezzlement. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Sam's voice was soft, almost inaudible as he spoke. "I didn't do it, Your Honor. I've been wrongly accused. I swear, I've never touched a cent that wasn't mine." The judge, a man named Jordan Graves, couldn't suppress a smirk as he glanced at the prosecutor, a young woman named Claire. She seemed to radiate confidence, her eyes glinting with the belief that she had the case in the bag. "Oh, I believe you, Mr. Green," Judge Graves said sarcastically. "You're just an old man, after all. How could you possibly be guilty of such complex crimes?" There was a chuckle from the gallery, and even Claire gave a dismissive smile. Sam's face, however, remained calm, his expression unreadable, though a flicker of pain flashed in his eyes. The courtroom erupted in laughter, and the judge banged his gavel, bringing the room to a halt. "Enough," Judge Graves declared. "Let's proceed with the case, but I must say, I'm not impressed. You might want to find someone more competent to represent you." Sam's lips parted slightly, but he said nothing. He simply nodded, though it was clear he was no stranger to being underestimated. As the trial progressed, it became increasingly clear that Sam was out of his element. He was no longer a young, sharp lawyer in the courtroom, but a frail old man struggling to remember even the simplest of facts. His hands trembled as he shuffled through papers, trying to present his case. His voice cracked when he tried to speak, and the judge continued to mock him at every turn. But Sam wasn't one to back down. He had lived a lifetime in the courtroom and had seen far worse than the sneering faces around him. In the back of the courtroom, a few people sat silently, observing the proceedings. One man stood out among the rest, a man with dark sunglasses, wearing a faded baseball cap pulled low over his brow. His gaze never left Sam. His presence was almost imperceptible, yet somehow, it felt as if he were the only one who truly understood what was at stake here. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The words echoed in the room, coming from the man in the back, though no one seemed to notice him. But Sam did. He turned his head slightly, catching the eye of the mysterious figure. There was something about the man that felt familiar. A sense of recognition tugged at him, though he couldn't quite place it. The man's presence was comforting in some strange way, though it did little to ease the tension in the room. As the trial wore on, it was clear that Sam's defense was failing. Every argument he made was met with ridicule. Every piece of evidence he presented was dismissed. Claire, the prosecutor, seemed to have everything figured out. She was meticulous, and her confidence grew with every passing minute. The young judge, though, seemed more and more amused, almost delighted by Sam's struggles. "Your Honor," Claire said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I believe it's clear that Mr. Green is guilty. The evidence is overwhelming, and his defense is a joke. I'd say it's time to wrap this up." Sam's heart sank. He had known this wasn't going to be easy, but he had hoped, somehow, that he might still find a way to win. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, and for a moment, he wondered if it was all over. But then, something unexpected happened. Just as Judge Graves was about to call for a recess, the man in the back of the courtroom stood up. His movements were deliberate, and though he was unassuming in appearance, there was a certain gravity to the way he moved. "Your Honor," the man said, his voice low but strong. I believe I can help. Everyone in the room turned to look at him. Even Judge Graves seemed taken aback, his expression momentarily faltering. You? The judge scoffed, his eyes narrowing. And who exactly are you? The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a badge. It was old, worn, but unmistakable. Clint Eastwood, the man said, his voice steady. And I'm here to defend Mr. Green. A wave of shock swept through the courtroom. There were murmurs and gasps, and Sam's eyes widened in disbelief. He had recognized the man's voice, but he never imagined it would be Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and director, now revealing himself as a genius attorney in disguise. The judge, still clearly stunned, recovered quickly. Mr. Eastwood, I don't know what kind of joke this is, but this is a court of law. If you're going to interfere, I'll have you removed. Clint Eastwood simply raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. I'm not here to make a joke, Your Honor. I'm here to make sure justice is served, Clint said calmly. Sam could hardly believe his ears. The courtroom, once filled with laughter and mockery, was now silent, all eyes fixed on Clint Eastwood. Sam, for the first time in what felt like forever, felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to take a turn for the better. The judge, still skeptical but unable to dismiss the presence of the legendary actor, motioned for Clint to take a seat at the defense table. As Clint sat down next to Sam, he leaned in slightly and whispered, "Don't worry, Sam. We're going to win this." Sam could hardly process what was happening. Clint Eastwood, the man who had fought for justice in countless films, was now fighting for him in the real world. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? As Clint Eastwood settled into the chair beside Sam, a sense of calm washed over the elderly man. Despite the turmoil that had enveloped the courtroom moments before, there was something undeniably reassuring about Clint's presence. His reputation, his voice, his stoic demeanor, it was clear that this man was no ordinary lawyer. Sam's heart raced as he tried to gather his thoughts. How was this even possible? The Clint Eastwood, the iconic actor and director, was sitting next to him, about to defend him in a case that had seemed lost from the very beginning. Clint Eastwood's reputation preceded him. He was a legend in the entertainment world, a man who had built his name playing gritty, determined characters. He had become a household name for his roles in films like Dirty Harry and Unforgiven. But what most people didn't know was that Clint had always been more than just an actor. In fact, in his younger years, he had studied law and practiced it briefly before his career in Hollywood took off. His love for justice, fairness, and the law had never waned, even as he became one of the most recognized faces in the world. Sam turned to Clint, his voice trembling slightly. I don't understand. How can you be here? Why are you helping me? Clint didn't look at Sam immediately. Instead, he stared ahead, his gaze sharp and focused. It was as if he was already planning his next move, mapping out the strategy in his mind. Finally, he turned to Sam, his blue eyes steady and calm. "Let me tell you something, Sam," Clint said in a low, gravelly voice. "I've been around the block a few times. I've seen people get crushed by the system. I've watched good men go down for crimes they didn't commit. And I've seen the people who should have been protecting them turn a blind eye. But you're not one of those people. You didn't do this, and I'm not going to let them make you pay for something you didn't do." Sam felt a surge of emotion, his eyes welling up. He had been so used to being ignored, mocked, and belittled by those around him, especially in the courtroom. Now, to have someone as famous and powerful as Clint Eastwood, stand by his side, it felt like a dream. "You're a legend," Sam said, still in disbelief. "Why me? You don't owe me anything." Clint's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. You'd be surprised how much one man can change the course of justice, Sam. If I'm going to spend my time fighting, I might as well fight for the right reasons. And helping you? This is as right as it gets. The conversation was interrupted as Claire, the prosecutor, stood up from her seat. Her gaze flicked over to Clint, her eyes narrowing as she crossed the courtroom toward him. So, this is who you've brought in to defend you, Mr. Green, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Clint Eastwood himself. I'm afraid the law doesn't work like one of your movies, Mr. Eastwood. Clint's steely gaze met hers, and for a moment, the room was silent. The air seemed to crackle with tension. It was as if everyone could sense the weight of what was happening. The young prosecutor, normally so confident and composed, was now visibly rattled by the presence of the Hollywood icon in her courtroom. Claire, Clint said calmly, the law is the law, and justice doesn't care who's wearing a suit or how many films they've starred in. But if you're asking if I'm taking this seriously, I assure you, I am. And if you think I'm going to let you walk all over my client, then you've got another thing coming. A hush fell over the courtroom. Claire paused, clearly thrown off by Clint's sudden assertiveness. She had thought she could easily win this case. After all, Sam Green was nothing more than an old man with no resources, no allies. But now, with Clint Eastwood in the mix, things were about to change. Judge Graves cleared his throat, attempting to restore order. Mr. Eastwood, I'm going to have to ask you to refrain from any more theatrics. This is a courtroom, not a movie set. Clint nodded slowly, not taking offense. Understood, Your Honor. I'm not here for theatrics. I'm here for the truth. The judge blinked, clearly disarmed by Clint's straightforward response. Well, let's hope you can deliver it. The truth, that is. As the judge called for the next phase of the proceedings, Clint turned to Sam, giving him a quick, reassuring look. Just trust me, he said softly. I'll handle this. For the first time since the trial began, Sam felt a spark of hope. Clint's words, his presence, were like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in a sea of uncertainty. There was no more mocking, no more belittling. The tides had turned. Sam's thoughts wandered back to the years when he had once been a prominent attorney himself, working long hours, building a reputation. But that was before life had thrown him curveballs that no amount of legal expertise could have helped him avoid. Divorce, health issues, and the weight of time had taken their toll. He had retired early, choosing to live out his days in quiet solitude, away from the hustle and bustle of the courtroom. Little did he know that fate had something far different in mind for him. As Clint leaned forward, gathering his papers, he gave Sam a knowing look. I know this is hard to believe, but we're going to win this. You're not the villain in this story, Sam. They are. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows that. Sam nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination coursing through him. The road ahead was long and difficult, but now, for the first time, he wasn't alone. And with Clint Eastwood in his corner, he felt like he had a fighting chance. The court session resumed, and the battle for justice was officially underway. Sam couldn't help but wonder how his life had come to this point, how everything had led to this one fateful day. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to let it end here. Not with Clint Eastwood standing beside him. As the gavel struck, signaling the start of the next phase of the trial, Sam knew that the real fight was only just beginning. The courtroom was charged with an energy that Sam had never experienced before. It wasn't just the presence of Clint Eastwood that had transformed the atmosphere, but the sense of expectation hanging in the air. The people around him, from the judge to the prosecutors to the gallery of onlookers, all seemed to sense that something monumental was about to unfold. But for the first time in a long while, Sam felt like he might just have a shot at winning. Clint Eastwood was no longer just a distant legend to him, he was his defense attorney, his ally, and his last hope. The trial resumed, and the prosecutor, Claire, began outlining her case in a way that seemed almost rehearsed. She stood with a practiced poise, laying out the evidence with clinical precision. Documents, bank statements, and financial records were introduced one by one, each showing what appeared to be undeniable proof of fraud. Sam could feel the weight of the accusations bearing down on him, each word a reminder of the uphill battle he was facing. But Clint wasn't fazed. He sat next to Sam, scanning the evidence with a sharp eye, his mind working in overdrive. He had seen cases like this before, though not in a courtroom quite like this one. As the prosecution presented its case, Clint's face remained impassive, not giving away a single emotion. But every now and then, he would glance at Sam and offer him a slight nod of reassurance. It was a simple gesture, but it carried so much weight. For Sam, it was a lifeline. Claire's voice echoed in the courtroom as she spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the evidence is clear. Samuel Green used his position to steal millions of dollars from his clients. His financial records show a series of unauthorized transfers, each one larger than the last. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate fraud." The jury listened intently, some nodding as they looked at the evidence presented before them. Sam felt his stomach churn. He had been a lawyer for decades, and while he knew the intricacies of the law, he had never been on the other side of such an accusation. This was a nightmare he couldn't have imagined. But Clint, as always, remained calm. When the prosecution finished their presentation, Clint stood up slowly, walking toward the center of the courtroom. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he scanned the room, his presence commanding attention. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Clint began, his tone firm but not harsh, "we're here today because a man is accused of something he didn't do. But let me tell you something about evidence. Evidence can be manipulated, it can be misconstrued, and sometimes, it can be outright false." Sam could feel the tension in the room as Clint continued, his every word cutting through the air with precision. "Now, I'm not going to stand here and tell you that the documents presented aren't real. I'm not going to deny that the numbers on those papers match up. But what I will tell you is this: those numbers don't tell the whole story. They don't tell you what was going on behind the scenes. They don't tell you that Samuel Green was targeted by people far more clever and far more sinister than anyone in this room." Clint's words hung in the air, and Sam could feel a spark of hope reigniting within him. There was a force to Clint's words, an undeniable power that seemed to shift the mood in the room. The jury, once skeptical, now seemed to be hanging on his every word. "Mr. Green," Clint continued, his eyes now fixed on Sam, "is not a criminal. He's not a fraud. What you see before you is an innocent man caught in a web of lies and deceit. And I'm going to prove it to you." The jury murmured amongst themselves, and even Claire seemed taken aback. Sam, though, was too stunned to speak. He had never seen anyone command a room quite like Clint did. There was something magnetic about him, something that made everyone sit up and listen. It wasn't just his fame. It was the undeniable belief in justice that radiated from him. As Clint sat back down beside Sam, he gave him another reassuring nod. "It's going to be okay, Sam. Just let me handle it." Sam nodded, though his mind was still reeling. This was his life, his freedom on the line, and yet here was Clint Eastwood, as calm and collected as if he were directing a movie. Sam felt a surge of gratitude that almost overwhelmed him. The trial continued, and Clint's cross-examination began. He turned his attention to the key witness in the case, the bank manager who had supposedly uncovered the fraudulent transfers. The man, a middle-aged gentleman with glasses and a nervous twitch, took the stand, his hands shaking as he adjusted his tie. Clint's voice was calm but sharp as he asked his first question. "Mr. Thompson, you're the one who found these so-called fraudulent transfers, correct?" The man nodded quickly, his eyes darting between Clint and the jury. "Yes, that's correct." Clint leaned in slightly, his gaze never leaving the witness. And you're sure that Mr. Green was behind these transactions? You're positive? Thompson hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable under Clint's scrutiny. I'm certain. I mean, the records show his name on the transactions. Clint nodded thoughtfully, taking a moment before speaking again. Let me ask you something, Mr. Thompson. Have you ever considered the possibility that someone else, someone with more access, more authority, might have been the one pulling the strings? Someone who might have used Mr. Green as a pawn in a much larger scheme? The question seemed to catch Thompson off guard. His eyes widened, and for a brief moment, his nervousness shifted into confusion. What do you mean? Thompson stammered. Clint's eyes narrowed. I mean, Mr. Thompson, that it's very easy to accuse someone of something, especially when they're old, frail, and seemingly incapable of defending themselves. But it takes a much deeper understanding of the truth to realize that the person you're accusing might not be the person responsible. The room fell silent, the tension palpable. For a moment, it seemed like time stood still. Even the jury leaned forward, captivated by Clint's words. Claire, the prosecutor, looked increasingly uncomfortable, her eyes darting between Clint and the witness. Clint's voice softened, but it carried the weight of authority. I'm not saying Mr. Green is innocent because I want him to be. I'm saying he's innocent because the evidence doesn't add up. And when the truth is finally revealed, you'll see that this entire case is based on nothing more than smoke and mirrors. Sam, watching Clint work, felt a surge of confidence. For the first time in the trial, he didn't feel like the underdog. With Clint Eastwood on his side, he felt like anything was possible. The jury remained quiet, their expressions unreadable, but Clint knew he had planted the seed of doubt. The real battle had only just begun, but for the first time in days, Sam felt like they were finally in control of their own fate. And with Clint Eastwood leading the charge, he couldn't help but believe that, against all odds, justice might just be within reach. The trial had taken a turn. Clint Eastwood had made an indelible mark in the courtroom. The jury, the witnesses, and even Claire, the prosecutor, were all on edge now. The tension in the air was palpable. Every word Clint spoke seemed to land with the precision of a well-aimed arrow. He had planted seeds of doubt in the minds of the jury, and now it was time to water them, let them grow, and watch as the web of accusations against Sam Green began to unravel. Clint's cross-examination of Thompson had been a masterstroke. In just a few minutes, he had turned the prosecution's key witness into a nervous, stammering wreck. Thompson, who had been so confident when he took the stand, now fumbled with his words, struggling to answer Clint's pointed questions. The doubts Clint had raised were now blooming in the jury's minds, and Sam could see it in their eyes. The questioning wasn't over yet, but Clint had already gained ground. He wasn't going to let up. Claire, however, was determined to regain control. She stood up from her seat and strode toward the witness stand, her heels clicking against the courtroom floor. Her composure was beginning to crack, and she knew that if she didn't act quickly, Clint would have the upper hand. Mr. Thompson, Claire said, her voice sharp and commanding, you've stated that you are absolutely certain Mr. Green was behind these transactions. Can you explain why, despite the evidence, you would now doubt your conclusions? Thompson hesitated. He was no longer the confident banker he had been earlier. The pressure from Clint's questioning had shaken him, and Claire's aggressive tone did little to help. I don't know, he stammered. It's just that, well, maybe I misunderstood. Maybe there's something else going on. I'm just not sure anymore. The room fell silent. Claire's eyes narrowed, and she glanced at Clint, who sat there, stone-faced, as if he had been expecting this. The tide was turning, and it was becoming harder for Claire to deny that the case against Sam Green was starting to crumble. The judge, who had remained a silent observer up until now, cleared his throat and addressed the courtroom. Mr. Thompson, your testimony is becoming inconsistent. If you are no longer certain of your conclusions, I suggest you refrain from further speculation. Thompson's face turned crimson. He looked at Claire, who was now visibly frustrated. She had been so sure that this case was airtight. But now, with every word Clint spoke, the pieces of her case seemed to be slipping away. The prosecutor, who had been so confident only hours before, now appeared to be on the defensive. Clint's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Your Honor, I believe we've seen enough from this witness. It's clear that he's not in a position to provide any solid evidence against my client. I respectfully request that we move on." Judge Graves looked at the prosecutor before nodding. "The court agrees. Mr. Thompson, you may step down." With that, Thompson practically ran off the witness stand, clearly eager to leave the spotlight. Claire gave him one last glance before turning her attention back to the jury, her frustration evident. She was losing control, and she knew it. Clint turned to Sam, who was still trying to process the rapid changes in the courtroom. Sam had never seen someone work a crowd like Clint. The man had an almost magical ability to shift the entire tone of the room, to make people doubt their own convictions without them even realizing it. "You're doing great," Clint said, his voice calm but reassuring. "Just stay focused." Sam nodded, his mind racing. He had been so certain that his life was over, that the evidence against him was too overwhelming to overcome. But now, with Clint's sharp legal mind at work, the landscape of the case was shifting. The doubt that had been planted in the jury's mind was beginning to bloom into something much bigger. And the more the web of lies and deceit unraveled, the closer they came to the truth. The prosecutor called another witness to the stand, a forensic accountant named Lisa Marlowe. She was young but had a reputation for being thorough and methodical. Sam had no doubt that Claire was hoping Marlowe's testimony would plug the holes in her case, but Clint was ready. He had been preparing for this moment for hours, and he wasn't going to let the opportunity slip by. When Lisa Marlowe began to speak, her voice was confident, almost too confident. She started to lay out the details of her findings, the financial discrepancies, the supposedly fraudulent transfers, and the damning evidence she had uncovered. Her words were clear, precise, and calculated, designed to make Sam look guilty. But Clint wasn't intimidated. He stood up, interrupting her mid-sentence. "Excuse me, Ms. Marlowe," Clint said, his voice smooth and controlled. "Before you go any further, I think we should clear something up." Lisa stopped mid-sentence, blinking in confusion. "What do you mean?" Clint's eyes sparkled with something like amusement. "You're presenting evidence, yes, but what you're not telling the jury is where this evidence came from. Who provided you with these financial documents, Ms. Marlowe? Who was the source?" Lisa hesitated, but she had already been caught in Clint's trap. I received the documents from the bank's internal investigation team," she said, her voice wavering. Clint smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Ah. So, the same team that had been working with Mr. Green's former partners. The same team that had an interest in framing him for something he didn't do." The room went still. Lisa's face went pale, and even Claire looked unsettled. Clint had just pointed out a crucial detail that had been overlooked, the possibility that the investigation into Sam's finances had been compromised from the start. It wasn't just the evidence that was flawed, it was the very people who had provided it. "Your Honor," Clint said, turning to Judge Graves, "I request that we subpoena the internal investigation team. We need to know who was behind this supposed evidence, and we need to find out why they were so eager to accuse my client without proper verification." Judge Graves looked thoughtful for a moment before nodding. "I'll allow it. We'll adjourn for the day. Mr. Eastwood, I expect the subpoena to be filed immediately." As the gavel came down, signaling the end of the day's proceedings, Sam could hardly believe what had just happened. Clint had just opened the door to an entirely new avenue of investigation, one that could blow the case wide open. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Sam turned to Clint, his voice filled with gratitude and disbelief. "How did you know? How did you figure all of that out?" Clint smiled, but there was no arrogance in his expression. It's all about paying attention to the details, Sam. Sometimes, you've got to look at things from a different angle. That's what makes the difference between a case you lose and a case you win. Sam nodded, feeling a newfound sense of hope. For the first time since his arrest, he believed that justice might actually be within reach. And with Clint Eastwood fighting for him, he had no intention of giving up now. The web was unraveling, and the truth was finally starting to come to light. But Clint knew that the hardest part was still ahead. There was more to this case than met the eye, and he wasn't about to stop until the entire truth was exposed. The morning of the next court session was unlike any Sam had ever experienced. He had spent most of the night going over the trial's details, flipping through the case files, and trying to piece together any potential discrepancies in the evidence. But the truth was, he couldn't stop thinking about Clint Eastwood. He had seen the legendary actor in movies his entire life, but never had he imagined that this man, this icon, would be his savior in the courtroom. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the judge entered. Judge Graves, who had remained impartial up until this point, had begun to show signs of impatience. He was a veteran in the legal world, and even he knew how rare it was for someone like Clint Eastwood to get involved in a case. And now, with every new turn in the trial, it seemed like Clint's methods were causing more and more waves in the legal waters. Sam sat at the defense table, his hands folded tightly together, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. Clint had been a man of few words, but the few words he'd spoken had carried immense weight. He had built a strategy not just on facts but on the psychology of the people involved in the case, the witnesses, the prosecution, and most importantly, the jury. But there was still a long way to go. The subpoena for the internal investigation team had been filed, and today, the defense would get their first real glimpse into who had been behind the investigation that had led to Sam's arrest. Sam couldn't help but feel the creeping sensation of something bigger at play, something far more intricate than just one man's legal battle. The trial resumed with the defense team waiting for any sign of the investigation team's involvement. Clint was calm, as always, sitting beside Sam, but his eyes scanned the room, alert to every shift in the atmosphere. He was like a hawk, observing, calculating, ready to strike at any moment. Claire, on the other hand, was visibly unsettled. She had been caught off guard by Clint's cross-examination, and the subpoena had thrown a wrench into her well-laid plans. She was known for being unflappable, but even she couldn't hide the tension creeping into her demeanor. Every moment that passed without the internal investigation team arriving felt like a small victory for the defense. When the witnesses finally arrived, 3 members of the internal team, there was an immediate shift in the room. The 3 men were dressed sharply, their expressions cold and professional. They didn't seem like the kind of people who would get caught in any kind of scandal. But Clint wasn't one to rely on appearances. He had already begun to connect the dots in his mind, and he knew there was more to this team than met the eye. The first of the 3 witnesses was called to the stand. His name was Richard Henson, and he was the lead investigator for the internal team. He sat with his hands folded in front of him, his expression unyielding. "Mr. Henson," Clint began, his voice cool but probing, "can you tell the court exactly who instructed you to conduct this investigation into Mr. Green's financial records?" Henson's eyes flickered for just a second before he responded, his voice firm. "The investigation was initiated by the bank's senior management. They felt there was a risk of fraud, and I was tasked with uncovering the details." Clint nodded slowly, his face neutral. "And who specifically gave you the order to look into Mr. Green's transactions?" There was a brief pause before Henson answered, his eyes shifting. "Mr. Gregory Wells, the chief risk officer." Clint's gaze sharpened. Gregory Wells. A man with a vested interest in seeing Mr. Green convicted, perhaps? Henson didn't immediately respond. The room grew tense as the implications of Clint's question hung in the air. Sam could feel his heart race as he looked at Clint. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Clint pressed on. Mr. Wells, as I understand it, has been trying to restructure the financial division for some time now. Is it possible that he had an interest in shifting blame onto Mr. Green to cover up any shortcomings in the bank's operations? Henson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but he kept his voice steady. I can't speak to that. My job was to conduct the investigation based on the evidence presented to me. Clint leaned forward, his voice lowering to a near whisper, but it carried through the room with startling clarity. Mr. Henson, I think it's important to remember that the truth isn't always what we're told to look for. Sometimes, it's buried beneath layers of lies. And if you're not careful, you might just find yourself complicit in a scheme that goes far beyond your understanding. The courtroom held its breath as Henson hesitated. His eyes darted nervously across the room. Sam could see the cracks forming in the man's armor. It was subtle, but it was there. The seeds of doubt had been planted. Your Honor, Clint said, turning toward Judge Graves, I believe we need to take a closer look at Mr. Wells' role in all of this. He may have orchestrated this entire investigation with the intention of framing my client. Judge Graves nodded, his eyes sharp. I'll allow further questioning on this matter, but be mindful that this is a serious accusation. Clint's eyes never wavered as he turned back to Henson. Mr. Henson, can you confirm whether or not Mr. Wells had any involvement in selecting which documents were to be reviewed in the investigation? Henson hesitated again, his unease growing. I don't know. I was simply tasked with reviewing Mr. Green's transactions. I didn't select the documents. Clint smiled, though it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Funny how that works. When you're given a task and told to only look at specific pieces of evidence, it's easy to see what you want to see, isn't it? The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Clint's insinuation settled into the minds of the jury. Claire stood up, visibly rattled. Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Eastwood is leading the witness with unsupported claims. Judge Graves raised an eyebrow but allowed the questioning to continue. Sustained, but Mr. Eastwood, please refrain from making assumptions. Clint nodded and sat back down, but not before delivering one last, piercing look at Henson. No further questions, Your Honor. Sam felt a surge of admiration for Clint as the cross-examination came to a close. The internal investigation team, once seen as infallible, was now under scrutiny. Clint had done more than just cast doubt on the evidence, he had suggested that there was a much larger conspiracy at play, one that reached all the way to the top. As the court session adjourned for the day, Sam stood up, his legs shaky but his heart pounding with anticipation. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the offense, not the defense. Clint had taken control of the narrative, and Sam couldn't help but feel that the pieces were falling into place. Good work today, Sam, Clint said, his voice low and reassuring. Sam managed a smile. I don't know how you do it. Clint shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Just keep your head in the game. The real battle is still ahead. Sam nodded, feeling a sense of hope he hadn't known in months. The fight wasn't over, but with Clint on his side, the road ahead seemed a little bit brighter. The following day was critical. After Clint's brilliant line of questioning, the case had taken an unexpected turn. The courtroom was abuzz with anticipation. The defense had opened a door that no one had expected, and now the prosecution was on the defensive. But as the day started, Clint knew this was only the beginning. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not when the stakes were so high. Sam walked into the courtroom with Clint beside him, trying to shake off the nerves that had plagued him since his arrest. He still couldn't believe that Clint Eastwood, the Clint Eastwood, was standing by his side, fighting to clear his name. The realization that this legendary actor turned attorney was his advocate filled him with a strange sense of gratitude and awe. The gavel sounded, and the judge, Judge Graves, called the session to order. We are here to continue with the questioning of the internal investigation team, he said, looking at the three men from the investigation team who had taken the stand the day before. Mr. Eastwood, You may proceed. Clint stood with the calm confidence that had become his trademark. Your Honor, thank you. I would like to continue questioning Mr. Henson about his involvement in this investigation. Henson, who had appeared so certain of his actions the day before, now seemed more unsettled. The pressure of Clint's questions weighed on him. Clint was sharp, always precise, and his subtle way of unearthing truths made people uncomfortable. Sam could feel the shift in the room as Clint approached the stand with the kind of composure that could make anyone second-guess their position. Mr. Henson, Clint began, his voice steady, yesterday you stated that you were simply following orders. But the documents you reviewed, can you confirm that they were all collected in a manner that adheres to standard protocol? Henson's eyes widened slightly. He cleared his throat and shifted in his seat. Yes, I was given specific instructions, and the documents were provided to me by the bank's legal team. Clint leaned in slightly. And how do you know these documents were not tampered with before they reached you? Henson hesitated again, the cracks in his confidence widening. I assumed they were legitimate. The legal team assured me that everything was in order. Clint's expression didn't change, but Sam could see the wheels turning in his mind. The weakness was there. The entire investigation had been based on an assumption that the documents were genuine. But in reality, no one had bothered to verify the integrity of the evidence before it was used against Sam. And now, that oversight was beginning to unravel the prosecution's case. Mr. Henson, Clint continued, isn't it possible that the documents you reviewed were selectively chosen to make Mr. Green appear guilty? Isn't it possible that they were presented to you with the sole purpose of framing him? The courtroom fell silent. Henson's face flushed, and for the first time, he looked uncertain. Sam watched as Clint's words landed, each one chiseling away at the foundation of the case. Clint wasn't just questioning Henson's credibility, he was questioning the entire investigation's legitimacy. Your Honor, Clint said, turning to Judge Graves, I believe it is clear that the investigation was flawed from the start. It was based on documents that may have been altered or manipulated, and there has been no proper chain of custody established for this evidence. I request that these documents be deemed inadmissible. The tension in the room was palpable as Judge Graves took a moment to consider Clint's request. Sam held his breath, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. If the documents were dismissed as inadmissible, the prosecution would lose one of its most important pieces of evidence. After a long pause, Judge Graves spoke. I will allow the request. The documents in question will be excluded from the trial until their authenticity can be verified. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The prosecution had just lost one of its biggest weapons. Sam couldn't believe it. Clint had done it again. He had dismantled their evidence piece by piece, and now the foundation of the case was crumbling. Claire stood up, her face a mixture of frustration and disbelief. Objection, Your Honor. The defense is making unfounded accusations. These documents were collected in good faith, and we have every reason to believe they are valid. But Judge Graves held up his hand, signaling for her to stop. Ms. Parker, I've made my ruling. Unless you can present further evidence to authenticate the documents, they will not be considered in this trial. Sam could see the color drain from Claire's face. Her once assured demeanor was quickly fading, replaced by a palpable sense of panic. This wasn't just a small setback for her, it was a massive blow to the case. She had been relying heavily on these documents, and now without them, her entire strategy was in jeopardy. Clint's voice cut through the tension. Thank you, Your Honor. I believe that concludes my questioning of Mr. Henson. As Henson stepped down from the stand, Clint turned to Sam with a small, knowing smile. We're making progress, he said. But don't get too comfortable. There's still more to uncover. Sam nodded, feeling both relieved and anxious. The evidence that had once seemed so solid was now in question, but the real battle was far from over. He knew that Clint had a plan, but Sam couldn't help but wonder what other pieces of the puzzle were still hidden from view. With the investigation team's testimony behind them, the court session adjourned for the day. As Sam and Clint made their way out of the courtroom, Clint's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen before slipping it back into his coat. "You okay?" Clint asked, noticing Sam's uneasy expression. Sam paused for a moment. "I'm still processing everything. It's hard to believe how quickly things have changed. But I know there's still more we need to do." Clint gave him a reassuring pat on the back. "One step at a time, Sam. The truth is on our side, but we've got to be careful. The closer we get, the harder they'll fight to cover it up." Sam nodded, realizing that Clint's words weren't just about the case, they were about the kind of fight this would become. The road ahead was treacherous, but with Clint by his side, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The following morning, the courtroom was brimming with tension. Sam sat at the defense table, anxiously drumming his fingers against the wood, as Clint sat beside him, scanning the room with his usual sharp gaze. The moment of victory the day before felt like a fleeting breath of fresh air, one that was quickly suffocated by the gravity of what lay ahead. Though the documents had been deemed inadmissible, Sam knew that the battle was far from over. Claire had made it clear that she wasn't about to back down. The next witness was scheduled to take the stand, and Clint had a feeling that this was going to be a turning point. As the gavel slammed down, signaling the beginning of the session, Judge Graves glanced between the two sides. "We are here to hear the testimony of the next witness, a Mr. Gregory Wells, the chief risk officer at the bank," he said, his voice steady. Sam's stomach churned. This was the man Clint had been hinting at for days, the man whose name kept cropping up in conversations. Clint had believed from the start that Wells was at the heart of the conspiracy to frame him, but up until now, Sam hadn't been entirely sure. Could Wells be the one pulling the strings behind the scenes? Clint gave Sam a reassuring nod. "Just stay focused. This is the key. Trust me." The doors to the courtroom opened, and Gregory Wells walked in. Sam had never seen him in person before, but the man looked exactly how Clint had described him, tall, impeccably dressed, and carrying an air of authority that seemed to command respect without a single word. His dark hair was perfectly combed, and his sharp suit gleamed under the fluorescent lights. He walked with purpose, his eyes never straying from the front of the room. Claire stood as Wells took the stand, her composure now regained after the setback of losing the documents. She didn't waste any time. "Mr. Wells," she began, her voice smooth and confident, "can you tell the court your role in the investigation regarding Mr. Sam Green?" Wells cleared his throat and leaned into the microphone. "As Chief Risk Officer, my job is to ensure the safety and integrity of our financial operations. When I became aware of irregularities in Mr. Green's transactions, I authorized an internal investigation to assess the situation." Clint's eyes flickered as he leaned forward slightly. There it was, the admission of involvement. Wells had been the one to give the order. The piece of the puzzle that Clint had been waiting for had just fallen into place. "Mr. Wells," Clint said, his voice calm but deliberate, "can you tell us exactly why Mr. Green was the subject of this investigation?" Wells straightened, adjusting his tie as though preparing for a fight. There were several red flags in Mr. Green's financial activity, particularly his transactions involving large sums of money transferred between accounts in a way that seemed suspicious. Clint's gaze didn't waver. "And how did you come to identify these transactions?" Wells looked a bit uncomfortable but answered, "The transactions were flagged by our automated system. It's part of our risk assessment process to identify patterns of potentially fraudulent behavior." Clint nodded slowly, allowing the information to sink in. "So, this was based on an algorithm? A system that flagged these transactions automatically?" Wells hesitated. "Yes, that's correct." Clint didn't miss a beat. "And you didn't personally verify any of the flagged transactions before initiating this investigation?" Wells stammered slightly. "No, I rely on the system to alert us to irregularities." That's why we have the system in place. I trust it. Clint's eyes narrowed. You trust a system that's programmed to find patterns, not truth. And you didn't think it was worth taking a second look at the transactions before accusing Mr. Green of a crime? Wells' face reddened. I made the decision based on the information I had. We had to act quickly. Clint's next question was a direct hit. And who specifically asked you to act quickly, Mr. Wells? Who was pushing you to investigate Mr. Green in such haste? Wells shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly avoiding the question. Sam could see the walls beginning to crack. Your Honor, Clint said, turning to Judge Graves, I believe this is the critical point. We need to know who pushed for this investigation so fervently. The truth is, it wasn't just about Mr. Green's transactions, it was about something much bigger. The courtroom was quiet, the tension so thick that it was almost tangible. Sam felt his heart race in his chest. Clint's questions weren't just digging into Wells' role, they were beginning to shine a light on something much more sinister. Judge Graves raised an eyebrow. Mr. Eastwood, please keep the focus on the matter at hand. Clint nodded but pressed on. Mr. Wells, I'll ask you again. Who instructed you to move forward with this investigation with such urgency? Wells shifted in his seat again, his discomfort growing by the second. He opened his mouth, but it was clear he wasn't prepared to give a direct answer. Finally, he exhaled deeply and muttered, it came from higher up. From the board. Clint's eyes glinted with triumph. The board. And who, specifically, on the board gave you that directive? Wells' gaze darted nervously. He knew he was cornered. It was Gregory Wells. I mean, it was someone on the board, but I can't give specifics. Clint's jaw tightened. You're telling us that someone from the board pressured you to push this investigation forward, but you're not sure who? Wells faltered. I don't have all the details. I just follow the chain of command. I did what I thought was best for the company. Clint's eyes darkened. You're telling this court that you followed orders without questioning them, despite the gravity of the accusations you were making against an innocent man? There was a long, agonizing pause before Wells spoke, his voice much quieter than before. I did what I was told. I'm not proud of it, but I thought I was helping. I was trying to protect the company. Clint shook his head slowly. No, Mr. Wells. You weren't protecting the company. You were protecting your own interests, and you let someone else use you as a pawn in a much larger game. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and the courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. Judge Graves, who had been silently observing, finally spoke. Mr. Wells, I'm going to remind you that your testimony is under oath. This court expects full cooperation. If you have information regarding any individuals or actions that may have influenced this investigation, you must disclose it. Wells' eyes were wide now, as though the full weight of his role in this conspiracy was beginning to settle in. He shifted uneasily in his chair. Sam could see the guilt written all over his face. The truth was starting to come to light, and the walls around Wells were crumbling faster than he could keep up. Clint's voice was calm but cutting. You've been caught in a lie, Mr. Wells. And you're not the only one. The board, whoever they are, has been manipulating this entire case. You've been a part of it, whether you wanted to be or not. Sam's heart skipped a beat. The pieces were finally falling into place, and Clint's theory was starting to hold water. But the battle wasn't over yet. There were still more questions to answer, and Sam knew that he had to stay focused. As Wells' testimony came to an end, the courtroom was left in stunned silence. It was clear that the investigation had been compromised from the start. The stakes had just gotten much higher, and the truth was beginning to emerge from the shadows. As the session adjourned, Sam turned to Clint. I don't know how you do it. You just destroyed their case. Clint's face remained stoic. It's not over yet, Sam. There's still more to uncover. But today, we took a step closer to the truth. Sam nodded, feeling a renewed sense of hope. The path to justice was finally becoming clear. The day after Gregory Wells' testimony was a whirlwind. Word of Clint's relentless cross-examination spread through the courthouse like wildfire. Everyone seemed to be talking about the powerful shift in momentum. Even Sam couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. But he knew better than to get comfortable. Clint had made it clear that there were still many layers to peel back, and not all of them were going to be as easy to expose as Wells' lies. As Clint and Sam made their way to the courtroom that morning, Sam could feel the tension rising again. The excitement from Wells' collapse had been short-lived, but now the real challenge was upon them. The prosecution, especially Claire, wasn't going to let up. Sam was certain she was plotting her next move, and he had no doubt it would be just as vicious as the last. Clint didn't seem too worried, though. His calm demeanor remained unshaken as they entered the courthouse. "They're coming for us, Sam," Clint said as they walked down the hallway toward the courtroom. "But that's just how it works. Every time you get a victory, they get desperate. And when they get desperate, they make mistakes." Sam wasn't so sure. He had watched enough courtroom dramas to know that when someone's reputation was on the line, especially someone like Claire Parker, they would fight tooth and nail to hold on. The deeper this case went, the darker it became. As they entered the courtroom, the familiar buzz of anticipation filled the air. Sam took his seat, glancing over at Claire, who was sitting across the room, her face cold and unreadable. She had her usual calm confidence back, but Sam could tell she was more determined than ever. She was plotting her next attack, and Clint was going to need all of his experience to stay ahead. Judge Graves called the session to order, and the room fell silent. "We are here today to continue the proceedings," the judge said, looking over his glasses at both sides. "Mr. Eastwood, it's your turn to call the next witness." Clint stood, his hands clasped behind his back. "Your Honor, the defense would like to call Mr. Harold Montgomery to the stand." The room shifted slightly as the doors opened, and in walked a man that Sam didn't recognize. He was middle-aged, with unkempt hair and a nervous energy about him. Sam could tell that he wasn't used to the spotlight of a courtroom, and he seemed to shrink under the intense scrutiny of the judge and the gallery. "Mr. Montgomery," Clint began, "can you please tell us about your role in the financial transactions at the bank?" Montgomery cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, visibly uncomfortable. I was part of the team that reviewed certain accounts. I didn't have the final say on most of the transactions, but I did assist with tracking suspicious activity." Clint nodded slowly, his voice steady. "And were you involved in the investigation into Mr. Green's activities?" Montgomery shifted in his seat. "Yes, I was asked to help identify patterns that might suggest fraudulent behavior. But I didn't think he was involved." He hesitated, looking down at his hands. "I thought something was off with the investigation. It didn't feel right." Sam leaned forward in his seat, his heart racing. This was unexpected. Montgomery was already throwing doubt on the integrity of the investigation. Was he about to become a whistleblower? Clint didn't waste any time. "What didn't feel right, Mr. Montgomery? Can you elaborate on that?" Montgomery looked around the courtroom, clearly nervous. He spoke in a low voice, but his words carried an undeniable weight. "I didn't know all the details at first, but when I reviewed the documents related to Mr. Green's account, I noticed discrepancies. I thought they were mistakes at first, but then I realized that some of the figures didn't add up. The numbers were manipulated." The gasp in the courtroom was palpable. Claire's face went white, and even Judge Graves looked taken aback. Sam felt the shock of the revelation hit him like a ton of bricks. If Montgomery was telling the truth, the entire case could come crashing down. Clint's expression didn't change, but Sam could see the quiet triumph in his eyes. "So, you're saying that the documents used to accuse Mr. Green were altered? Who would have had the access to alter them?" Montgomery swallowed hard. I'm not sure. But I've seen people in higher positions than mine make decisions that I couldn't explain. I think someone with more authority was manipulating things behind the scenes. I didn't want to be involved, so I kept quiet. But after seeing what happened to Mr. Green, I couldn't stay silent anymore. Clint's voice was sharp now, his words measured. You've made a very serious accusation, Mr. Montgomery. Are you prepared to name who might have been behind this? Montgomery shifted uncomfortably again, glancing nervously at Claire. The tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. Everyone was waiting for him to speak, to expose the person behind the manipulation. Montgomery faltered, then finally nodded. I think it was Gregory Wells. I saw him in the office after hours a few times, looking over some documents that had Mr. Green's name on them. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I realize it was all connected. Sam felt a wave of coldness wash over him. Wells? The man who had been one of the central figures in the prosecution's case. The one who had been so quick to launch the investigation. Judge Graves banged his gavel, calling the courtroom to attention. Mr. Montgomery, you have just provided very serious information. I must ask you to be absolutely certain of your statement. Are you certain that Gregory Wells had access to the documents and was responsible for altering them? Montgomery hesitated, his hands shaking. Yes, I'm sure. I didn't understand it at the time, but now I see that it all fits together. Clint turned to Judge Graves. Your Honor, I would request that the court compel Mr. Wells to testify immediately, as his actions have clearly influenced the outcome of this case. The judge nodded, his expression grim. We will adjourn for a brief recess to allow for further consideration of this new information. Please be prepared to call Mr. Wells as the next witness. As the courtroom emptied for the break, Sam couldn't believe what had just happened. It was all coming together. Clint had played a dangerous game, but it was paying off. Gregory Wells, his former boss, was at the center of this web of lies and manipulation. Sam turned to Clint, who was already looking at him with a knowing expression. This is it, Sam. This is where it all changes. Sam nodded slowly, still processing the depth of the revelation. What now? Clint's eyes gleamed with determination. Now we finish this. We expose the truth. But it's not going to be easy. They'll come for us harder than ever, but I'm not backing down. And neither are you. As they walked out of the courtroom for the brief recess, Sam felt a surge of gratitude. Clint wasn't just a lawyer, he was a master of the game. And for the first time in a long while, Sam felt like he had a fighting chance. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation as the recess ended. Sam and Clint had just finished their private conversation, and the weight of the moment was becoming clearer with each passing second. Sam knew that Gregory Wells' testimony had shifted the entire case into a new gear. The question now was whether it would be enough to break the back of the prosecution's strategy. It was a high-stakes gamble, one that Clint had orchestrated with the precision of a master. The door to the courtroom opened, and the gavel sounded, signaling the resumption of the trial. Sam took his seat beside Clint, who sat as calm as ever, his eyes scanning the room as though he were already anticipating what was about to unfold. Claire was standing by her table, her expression a mixture of frustration and determination. She had clearly prepared for this moment, but she had been blindsided by Montgomery's testimony. Sam could tell she was recalibrating, readying herself for whatever came next. It was clear this wasn't going to be a straightforward fight. Let's begin, Judge Graves said, his stern voice breaking the tension in the room. We will hear from Mr. Wells. I trust the prosecution has located him and is prepared to call him to the stand. Claire stood, her back straight, her eyes never leaving the judge. Your Honor, the prosecution requests a brief moment to locate Mr. Wells. It's crucial that we give him the proper time to prepare for his testimony. Judge Graves raised an eyebrow. A moment, Ms. Parker. But not too long. This court will not tolerate delays. Sam's heart pounded in his chest. If Wells wasn't already present, that meant he was about to be summoned under intense scrutiny. The implications of this move were enormous. If the court could officially tie Wells to the conspiracy, the case would likely fall apart. However, if Wells remained elusive or refused to testify, it could spell disaster. A few tense minutes passed before the door to the courtroom opened again, and in walked a figure Sam had only seen on security footage, Gregory Wells himself. The crowd in the gallery murmured as the tall, imposing figure entered the room, his once sure demeanor now replaced by clear apprehension. His suit was impeccable, but there was something about his posture that screamed unease. Sam could see the sweat beading on Wells' forehead. Clint, without skipping a beat, stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, it is the defense's position that Gregory Wells' actions have been key to uncovering the fraud in this case. We intend to explore the extent of his involvement, and I request that Mr. Wells testify openly and honestly regarding the circumstances surrounding his actions. Wells glanced over at Clint, his face pale. He seemed to consider bolting, but the courtroom's intense focus pinned him in place. The judge gave a firm nod. Mr. Wells, please take the stand, Judge Graves said. As Wells moved to the witness chair, the tension was palpable. Sam could practically hear his own heartbeat. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The puzzle pieces had fallen into place, but now it was time for Wells to confess, at least, that was Clint's plan. Wells sat down, adjusting his glasses nervously. The court clerk swore him in, and he lowered his gaze to the table, avoiding eye contact with anyone, especially Clint. Clint began, his tone casual but loaded with intent. Mr. Wells, thank you for joining us today. I'm sure you're familiar with the purpose of this trial. Wells nodded stiffly, his voice trembling. Yes, I'm aware. Clint didn't waste time with pleasantries. You're here because you were part of the investigation into Mr. Green's financial activities, correct? Wells shifted in his seat, a bead of sweat running down his temple. Yes. Clint leaned forward, his piercing eyes never leaving Wells. And you've already admitted that you were involved in flagging Mr. Green's transactions. But we've heard testimony today that suggests the documents used against Mr. Green may have been altered. I'd like you to explain that. Wells' eyes darted nervously to Claire, who was sitting at her table, biting her lip. He then turned his gaze back to Clint. I don't know what you mean, Wells stammered, though his voice lacked conviction. I followed standard procedure. There were discrepancies in the accounts, and we flagged them. That's all. Clint smiled softly, almost mockingly. Standard procedure? Or was it a coordinated effort to frame Mr. Green? His voice dropped lower, his tone becoming more direct. Tell us, Mr. Wells, were you working alone when these documents were altered, or were you following someone else's orders? Wells swallowed hard. The entire courtroom was holding its breath, waiting for the confession. I didn't alter the documents, Wells said, his voice trembling. I just followed instructions. Clint raised a hand to interrupt. Instructions from whom, Mr. Wells? From who did you take your orders? Wells hesitated, his face pale, clearly torn between protecting himself and revealing the truth. He opened his mouth but then closed it again, unsure of how to proceed. Claire, visibly on edge, stood up suddenly. Objection, Your Honor. The line of questioning is speculative and unfounded. The witness has already stated he followed protocol. Judge Graves nodded but turned to Clint. Mr. Eastwood, please stick to the facts. Clint didn't flinch. I am, Your Honor. And the facts are clear. We now know that Gregory Wells has admitted to taking orders from higher-ups to pursue this investigation without considering the real evidence. The question now is who was behind those orders. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as people turned to glance at each other. Claire's face reddened with frustration as she clenched her jaw. She hadn't expected Clint to press this hard. Wells, looking desperate, finally mumbled, I don't want to get anyone else involved. I was just doing my job. Clint's eyes narrowed. Your job, Mr. Wells, was to protect the bank's integrity. Not to participate in a scheme to ruin an innocent man's life. Wells' hands were shaking now. Sam could see the cracks forming, his defiance was crumbling under Clint's relentless pursuit of the truth. Wells' voice lowered. It was Mr. Hansen. Robert Hansen, the CEO. He told me to move forward with the investigation against Mr. Green. He said we had to protect the company from the media fallout. He wanted to make an example of Mr. Green. The revelation hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Sam sat frozen in his chair, his mind racing as the implications of Wells' words sank in. Robert Hansen, the CEO, the very man who stood at the top of the organization, was behind the entire scheme. He had been pulling the strings from the beginning. Clint, a smile tugging at his lips, addressed the judge. Your Honor, I think we found the smoking gun. Judge Graves looked at Wells, his face grim. Mr. Wells, you have just made a very serious admission. You have implicated Mr. Robert Hansen in this matter. I will instruct the prosecution to investigate this further. Until then, I must caution you that your role in this case is far from over. Wells slumped in his chair, visibly defeated. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was just following orders. I never wanted to hurt anyone. Clint stood up, his voice calm and decisive. But you did, Mr. Wells. And now we have the truth. As the courtroom began to buzz with activity, Sam felt a surge of relief wash over him. It wasn't over yet, but the tides had shifted irreversibly. The man at the top, the one who had orchestrated everything, was now in the spotlight. Clint turned to Sam, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. That's one step closer, Sam. We're not done yet, but we've got them on the ropes. Sam nodded, the weight of the moment sinking in. They were about to take down the real criminals, if they could survive the final storm that was sure to follow. The courtroom buzzed with conversation as the revelation about Robert Hansen began to settle in. The last few minutes felt like a whirlwind of truth, lies, and consequences. Sam could see it in the faces of the gallery, the shock, the disbelief. The idea that the CEO of one of the most respected banks in the country was behind a massive conspiracy was unfathomable to most. But Clint knew that this was only the beginning. As the judge adjourned for a lunch break, Clint leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but sharp, as though he were already plotting the next move in the chess game. Sam watched him closely, still processing what had just happened. He could feel the adrenaline of the courtroom fading, replaced by the heavy realization that the fight was far from over. Clint, Sam said, his voice low but urgent, this is it. If we're right about Hansen, everything changes. But it's not going to be that easy, is it? Clint looked over at him, his eyes steely and focused. No, Sam. It's never that easy. Hansen is powerful, and his reach goes far beyond this courtroom. But we've got a crack in the armor, and we're going to widen it. We've got the truth now. The key is making sure we don't let them spin it. Sam ran his hands through his hair. But how do we expose Hansen? He's not going to just fold. He'll find a way to cover this up. Clint nodded slowly. Exactly. And that's where you come in. You've been a part of this case since the beginning. You've seen how Wells was used as a pawn. But now we have to go after Hansen directly, get him to reveal his true role in this mess. It won't be easy, but you've got to keep your focus. The truth's on our side. As the courtroom doors opened again and the break came to a close, Sam stood up, trying to steady his nerves. It wasn't just the trial that was weighing on him, it was the stakes. If they lost this battle, the consequences would be devastating for not only Mr. Green but also anyone who dared to expose the rot at the top. Returning to his seat, Sam looked across the room at Claire Parker, who was deep in conversation with her colleagues. Her face was tense, her jaw set in determination. Sam could tell she wasn't going to let the admission about Hansen slide without a fight. There was no doubt she would do everything in her power to deflect and cover up the truth. She was a skilled prosecutor, after all. The judge's gavel slammed down, signaling the resumption of the trial. As everyone settled back into their seats, the air felt thicker, heavier, as if the entire room was holding its breath in anticipation. This was it, the tipping point. Judge Graves cleared his throat. "Mr. Eastwood, do you have any further questions for Mr. Wells, or will you proceed with calling the next witness?" Clint stood, his gaze never wavering from Wells. "Yes, Your Honor. I have a few more questions." Clint's voice was calm but carried a weight that sent ripples of tension through the courtroom. Wells, looking even more frail than before, shifted uneasily in his seat. The sight of the man who had once seemed so powerful now trembling under Clint's questioning was something Sam wouldn't soon forget. "Mr. Wells," Clint began, his voice steady, "you've just implicated Robert Hansen, the CEO of the bank. I believe it's important to clarify your role in this situation. Were you the only one who was asked to manipulate the investigation, or were there others involved?" Wells swallowed hard, his throat dry. I don't know if there were others. But I do know Hansen wanted this investigation to go as smoothly as possible. He said it was in the best interest of the company." Clint leaned forward, his voice soft but filled with intent. "Best interest of the company, or best interest of yourself, Mr. Wells? Because, as you know, destroying Mr. Green's life was hardly in anyone's best interest, except for maybe your own." Wells' hands trembled. I was trying to protect my position," he muttered, his voice breaking. "I didn't want to lose everything. I did what I was told, and now I regret it." Sam's chest tightened. There it was, the admission. It wasn't just about protecting the company anymore. It was about Wells protecting his own skin. Clint continued, "You've clearly done more than your share of damage, Mr. Wells. But do you realize that, by testifying here today, you've opened a door that can lead to something much bigger than this case? You've implicated the man at the top. That means you're no longer a pawn. You're part of a much larger scheme." Wells looked down at his feet, his eyes brimming with tears. "I didn't want this. I didn't want any of this. I just didn't think it would go this far." Sam could feel the weight of the moment. Wells was starting to crack wide open, but the question remained, would he give up Hansen, or would he continue to protect him, even at the risk of his own future? Clint paused for a moment, allowing the silence to stretch between them, before speaking again. "Mr. Wells, if you had a chance to undo all of this, to make things right, would you?" Wells hesitated for a long time before looking up. His face was a mask of regret. I don't know if I can undo it, but I will testify against Hansen. He's the one who orchestrated everything. I'm not going down for him." A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. The admission was explosive. It wasn't just an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, it was the beginning of the unraveling of the case. The truth about Hansen was starting to spill out, and it could no longer be ignored. Judge Graves slammed his gavel down. "Mr. Wells, your testimony has been noted. The court will adjourn for another brief recess while we review the implications of this new information. Mr. Eastwood, I trust you'll be prepared to move forward with your case." As the courtroom began to empty for the break, Sam stood up, his mind racing. This was the breakthrough they'd been waiting for, but it was far from over. Hansen would fight back, and they would need to be prepared for everything he could throw at them. Clint turned to Sam with a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "This is it, Sam. The pieces are falling into place. We've got them now. But stay sharp. This is where it gets dangerous. Sam nodded, feeling a fire of determination ignite within him. They were close, closer than ever before. But the next few days would be the hardest of their lives. They had the truth, but would it be enough to bring down the empire that had been built on lies? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The courtroom was buzzing with quiet whispers as the recess ended. Sam felt a knot in his stomach. The implications of Gregory Wells' testimony had sent shockwaves through the room, and now the stakes had never been higher. With Robert Hanson's name exposed, the entire case had taken a sharp turn. The calm before the storm was over. The battle lines had been drawn, and Sam knew they were about to dive headfirst into a much larger war. Clint, ever the picture of composure, had a subtle smile on his lips, but Sam could see the weight in his eyes. This was no longer just a case about a single financial scandal, this was about a massive cover-up, one that reached deep into the heart of the institution, and now the real fight was about to begin. As they made their way back into the courtroom, Sam noticed Claire Parker's steely gaze from across the room. She wasn't one to back down easily, and this admission about Hanson would not be the last challenge they faced. If anything, it would only intensify her resolve. Sam had seen it before, the way the best prosecutors would dig in, fight tooth and nail, and never let a lead slip away without a fight. Sam, Clint, Claire's voice was low, but sharp as she approached them during the break. You've got your little victory with Wells, but you're missing the bigger picture. Hanson won't just fold. He's too entrenched, too powerful. You've stirred the hornet's nest, but I wouldn't be so sure about your success just yet. Clint's smile widened ever so slightly, a silent acknowledgement of the challenge. That's the fun part, Claire. The bigger picture is starting to unravel, and you'll see soon enough. Claire's jaw tightened. You think this ends with a few admissions from one man? You've got no idea what you're up against. Hanson has connections everywhere, and he's been playing this game for years. The media, the board of directors, even law enforcement, they're all in his pocket. You can't just go after him without consequences. Clint nodded thoughtfully. Consequences are part of the package, Claire. But it's time someone finally brought the truth to light. Claire's lips curled into a tight, grim smile as she glanced at Sam. You're playing with fire. Just remember that. Before Sam could respond, the gavel struck again, signaling the return to court. As they all filed back into the courtroom, the weight of the situation hit Sam again. This wasn't just about courtroom strategies anymore. It was about survival. Clint was taking on one of the most powerful men in the country, and he had no plans of backing down. As the court reconvened, Judge Graves addressed the room with his usual stern tone. We will now proceed. Mr. Eastwood, do you intend to call your next witness, or will you be making your closing arguments? Clint rose from his seat with a quiet confidence that radiated through the room. He knew this was the pivotal moment, the point where the truth could either continue to unravel or where the defense could attempt to bury it once and for all. Your Honor, I'm not making closing arguments just yet, Clint said, his voice calm but cutting through the tension like a blade. We've still got a few more pieces to put together before we reach that stage. Clint motioned to Sam, who quickly stood and made his way to the witness stand. We'll be calling our next witness, Your Honor. As Sam took his seat, he could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him. For a moment, he allowed himself to remember the weight of this journey. This case had started as a simple financial dispute, but now it had become something far greater, and Sam was standing at the center of it all. He wasn't just defending an individual anymore, he was defending the truth. Clint stood beside him, a reassuring presence. Mr. Green, Clint began, his voice calm yet authoritative. Before we move forward with our next witness, let's take a moment to address some critical points. Mr. Green, you've been through a lot these past few weeks. Tell us how the charges against you have impacted your life. Sam was ready for this question. He had spent hours going over what he would say, how he would humanize the story. This wasn't just a case about documents and numbers, it was about the damage done to a man's reputation, his livelihood, his very existence. Taking a breath, Sam looked up at the jury, then out at the gallery. "It's been devastating," he began. "The last few months of my life have been consumed by this trial. I've lost relationships, trust, and my reputation. I've worked my entire life to build a career, to become someone who people could rely on. But now, because of these false accusations, I've lost everything. The people who were closest to me, they've walked away. And all because someone chose to frame me, to destroy my life for their own benefit." Sam paused, his voice thick with emotion. "It's not just the financial loss. It's the emotional toll. The sleepless nights. The constant fear. The humiliation. I've been made into a villain, someone I'm not. And I'm here because I want the truth to come out. Because I want the world to know who's really responsible for this." The room was silent as Sam spoke, the weight of his words hanging in the air. He wasn't just a defendant anymore. He was a man fighting for his future, his dignity, and his life. Clint nodded, his expression somber. "Thank you, Mr. Green. Your words speak volumes. And now, Your Honor, we would like to call our next witness, a witness who will shed light on the heart of this conspiracy." The doors to the courtroom opened, and a man in his late 50s stepped inside. He was well dressed, but there was an air of discomfort about him, someone who had clearly been dragged into this situation against his will. His name was Richard Hayes, an ex-investigator with the bank's internal audit team. Sam had no doubt about his role in this case. He had been one of the first people to uncover evidence that pointed to Hansen's manipulation of the investigation. As Hayes made his way to the witness stand, Sam's heart rate quickened. This man held the key to unlocking the final truth. But what would he say under pressure? Clint's voice broke through the tension. "Mr. Hayes, thank you for joining us today. You were once employed by the bank as an internal investigator, correct?" Hayes nodded, clearly uncomfortable. "Yes, I was. During your time with the bank, you were responsible for reviewing financial records and ensuring compliance, is that correct?" "That's right," Hayes replied. Clint continued, his tone sharp. "And during the course of your investigations, did you ever come across any irregularities in the handling of Mr. Green's case?" Hayes hesitated, his hands shaking slightly. "Yes," he said finally. "I found discrepancies in the way certain transactions were handled. There were documents that had been altered, reports that didn't match up with the actual transactions. I knew something wasn't right. But when I tried to bring it up, I was told to drop it. I was threatened with termination if I pursued it further." Sam could feel the room shift. Hayes was revealing the cracks in the system, cracks that led directly to Hansen. It was all starting to fall into place. Clint leaned in, his voice low but determined. "And who, exactly, told you to drop the investigation? Who threatened you?" Hayes swallowed hard, his face pale. "It was Robert Hansen. He said that if I didn't stop investigating, I'd be out of a job. He said the company's reputation was more important than the truth." The courtroom was silent. Every person in that room understood the weight of Hayes' words. The CEO had not only been involved in orchestrating the scheme, but he had also used his position to silence anyone who got too close to the truth. Clint turned to the judge, his voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, it's clear that Robert Hansen is the mastermind behind this entire conspiracy. We have exposed the web of deceit he's woven, and it's time for the truth to be acknowledged." As Sam looked around the room, he knew the game had changed. The truth was out. Now, it was up to the court to decide whether it would bring justice or let the web of lies continue to ensnare them all. The courtroom was tense. The walls seemed to close in around Sam as Clint stood by his side, preparing to make the most crucial move of the case. Richard Hayes' testimony had been a devastating blow to the defense, but everyone knew this wasn't the end. It was merely the beginning of the final phase, the phase that would either bring down Robert Hansen or let him slip away once again. The prosecution's case was crumbling under the weight of the evidence that Clint had skillfully presented. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with anticipation. The defense had one last chance to regroup, one last chance to put up a fight. But Clint wasn't backing down. Not now. Judge Graves cleared his throat, signaling the room to fall silent as he addressed the defense. "Ms. Parker," he said, his voice cutting through the tension, "do you have any rebuttal evidence or witnesses to call?" Claire Parker rose from her seat slowly, her face stern and composed. She wasn't going to make this easy. Sam could see the fire in her eyes. This wasn't just a battle for a conviction anymore, this was about pride. This was about stopping Clint from winning. "I do, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, but there was an underlying edge to it. She turned and gestured toward the door, signaling for someone to come forward. "I would like to call our final witness, a key figure in this investigation. Someone who can clarify the truth behind the events Mr. Eastwood has so carefully manipulated." Sam's stomach tightened as the doors to the courtroom opened, and a tall figure walked into the room. His stride was confident, but Sam could tell there was something off about him. His appearance seemed carefully orchestrated, his suit impeccable, his hair slicked back, but there was a coldness in his eyes, a calculated look that made Sam uneasy. This man was no ally to justice. Clint's expression didn't change, but Sam could feel the shift in the air. Whoever this witness was, he was going to make things difficult. The man stepped up to the witness stand, and Claire introduced him. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court, this is David Silverman, a senior partner at Silverman & Associates, a prestigious law firm with close ties to the bank. Mr. Silverman has overseen numerous high-profile cases involving Mr. Green and Mr. Hansen's company. He's been involved in many of the negotiations and transactions that have come under scrutiny in this trial." Clint's eyes narrowed. He had been expecting this. David Silverman was more than just a high-powered attorney, he was a fixer, a man who specialized in keeping things out of the public eye. And now, it seemed, he was about to take his turn defending Hansen. "Mr. Silverman," Claire began, her voice dripping with confidence, "I'd like to ask you about the meetings you attended with Mr. Hansen regarding Mr. Green's case. Were you aware of any efforts to manipulate the investigation or any unethical actions taken by the bank to undermine Mr. Green?" Silverman's lips curled into a slight smile as he leaned forward. "Ms. Parker, I've been involved in many cases throughout my career, and while I cannot speak for every detail, I can tell you that every action taken by Mr. Hansen and the bank was in line with the best interests of the company. There was no manipulation. No dishonesty." Sam's heart sank. This was it. This man would lie through his teeth to protect Hansen, and his connection to the law firm made him a formidable adversary. But Sam knew they couldn't let him get away with it. Not now. Clint stepped forward, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Mr. Silverman," he said, his voice smooth, "you're a senior partner at a prestigious firm, aren't you? And you've represented Hansen and the bank in multiple matters, including the investigation into Mr. Green?" Silverman nodded, his eyes gleaming with an air of superiority. "That's correct." Clint continued, "And isn't it true that your firm has deep financial ties with Mr. Hansen's company? Isn't it also true that you've been involved in orchestrating settlements that were designed to keep Mr. Green's case from ever reaching the public eye?" Silverman's smile faltered, but he quickly recovered. "That's an exaggeration, Mr. Eastwood. My firm has represented the bank in many cases. Our role is to provide legal counsel, not to manipulate outcomes." Clint's gaze sharpened. "Isn't it also true, Mr. Silverman, that in your capacity as a lawyer, you've been involved in off-the-record meetings with the bank's board members to ensure that Mr. Green's case never saw the light of day?" There was a long pause before Silverman answered. He looked around the room, clearly searching for a way out, but Clint's words were like a trap closing in on him. I don't recall the specifics of any such meetings, Silverman finally said, but the way his voice wavered betrayed him. Clint pressed on. What I think you mean to say, Mr. Silverman, is that those meetings didn't exist on paper. But I believe we both know that your firm was paid handsomely to ensure that the truth was buried. And I think it's safe to assume that your firm's extensive connections to Mr. Hansen's company weren't just about legal services, were they? Silverman's face flushed. He opened his mouth to respond, but Clint wasn't finished. Mr. Silverman, Clint continued, I have a piece of evidence here, an email exchange that you had with Mr. Hansen's legal team. The email discusses how to handle the pressure from an ongoing investigation into Mr. Green's financial dealings. I believe you'll recognize the subject line, ensuring a closed door on Green's case. A murmur went through the courtroom as Clint produced a stack of documents. He laid them on the table, then pushed them toward Silverman. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited for the senior partner to respond. Silverman's face turned white as he scanned the documents. His fingers trembled as he picked up the first page and read it through. The silence was deafening. No one moved. Not even the judge, who was clearly taken aback by Clint's bold move. Finally, Silverman dropped the papers onto the table, his hands shaking. He didn't even look up at Clint or the jury. I can explain, he stammered. But his voice lacked conviction. He had been caught. Clint's tone remained unflappable. No more explanations, Mr. Silverman. You've been involved in this from the beginning. You knew exactly what was happening, and now we have the proof. And I'll tell you this, there's no amount of legal doublespeak that can cover up your role in this. The room held its breath. The entire case had just taken a decisive turn. David Silverman, a senior partner at a prestigious law firm, had been exposed as complicit in the conspiracy. With this revelation, it was clear that Robert Hansen's empire was crumbling. And there was no turning back. Sam's heart raced as he looked around the courtroom. This was it, the turning point. There was no way the defense could recover from this. The truth had been exposed, and now it was just a matter of time before justice would be served. But as Clint turned to face the judge, Sam knew the battle wasn't over yet. The war for justice had only just begun. The courtroom was still in shock. The bombshell Clint had just dropped had hit with the force of 1,000 pounds. The admission that David Silverman, a senior partner at one of the most respected law firms in the country, had been complicit in the cover-up, had effectively shattered the carefully constructed mask of integrity that Hansen's empire had so skillfully worn for years. The room buzzed with whispers, some of disbelief, others in quiet anticipation. Sam's heart raced as he watched Silverman stumble, his usual composure now replaced with panic. Judge Graves, his usually stern demeanor softened by the weight of the revelation, glanced at Silverman. Mr. Silverman, do you have any further testimony to offer, or shall we proceed with the next step of the proceedings? Silverman stood there, trembling, his mouth agape. He looked as though he wanted to say something, but the words caught in his throat. Clint's move had left him utterly exposed. The papers on the table, the damning email exchange, the links to Hansen's manipulation of the investigation, had done the trick. There was no denying it anymore. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Silverman spoke. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried throughout the room. I cannot deny what's been presented, Silverman admitted, his voice cracking with the weight of his admission. But I was just following orders. I was told to keep things quiet, keep it from the public eye. And I thought I was protecting the company. I never imagined it would go this far. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. The confession wasn't enough to absolve him of guilt, but it was enough to tip the scales further in Clint and Sam's favor. This wasn't just about one man's involvement in a cover-up, it was about the network of lies that had been built over the years. And now, the truth was unraveling thread by thread. Clint stepped forward, his voice calm but full of authority. "Mr. Silverman, do you truly believe that your actions were justified? You knew what was happening. You chose to participate in a scheme that ruined lives, destroyed reputations, and ultimately led to the destruction of an innocent man's career. You didn't follow orders. You made a choice, and you've been lying about it ever since." Silverman's face reddened, and his eyes darted nervously around the room. But Clint wasn't finished. "Now, let's talk about Robert Hansen. The man who you've been so loyal to. Do you really think he would have done anything differently if it were you sitting on the other side of the table? Hansen is not a man of integrity, Mr. Silverman. He's a man who's used people like you to cover his own tracks. And you, like so many others, are complicit in his empire of deceit." The word stung, and Silverman looked like he had been slapped. There was no coming back from this. The pieces had fallen into place, and now everyone in the courtroom could see the full extent of the corruption that had permeated Hansen's empire. Silverman's shoulders slumped as he sat down at the witness stand. I didn't know how far things had gone," he muttered, barely audible. "I thought I was doing my job." Clint's gaze never wavered as he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, we rest our case. The defense has no further witnesses, and it is clear that the conspiracy surrounding Robert Hansen and his company has been exposed." Judge Graves nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Very well. The court will recess for the day, and we will reconvene tomorrow to hear closing statements and make a final determination in this case. This has certainly been an intense few days, and the court has much to consider." As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the day's proceedings, Sam let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The weight of the case was immense, but Clint had navigated them through it with the precision of a seasoned strategist. They had made it to the final stretch. Now, it was time for the world to see how the story would end. That evening, Clint and Sam sat in the law office, the dim light of a desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. Sam was sitting at the table, reviewing the case files, while Clint paced the room, his mind clearly working at full capacity. "You did great today, Sam," Clint said, his voice calm but laced with approval. Silverman's testimony was a game-changer. He was the linchpin that connected the dots. Once the jury hears all this, Hansen won't have a leg to stand on. Sam nodded but didn't look up from the papers. His mind was racing. They were so close, but the thought of the jury's decision was gnawing at him. A lot could happen in that final stretch. One wrong move, one misstep in their closing arguments, and it could all fall apart. They'd fought too hard to let it slip away now. "I know," Sam said, rubbing his eyes. "But what if they still buy the defense's lies? What if they're not convinced?" Clint stopped pacing and turned to face him, his gaze steady. "Sam, this isn't about what they believe. This is about what we've shown them. The truth has been laid bare. Silverman, Wells, the emails, they all point in one direction. Hansen is the mastermind, and the rest is just noise. It's up to the jury to sift through the lies, but we've given them the tools they need." Sam nodded again, but the tension in his chest didn't ease. Clint was right. The evidence was solid. But in the world of high-profile cases like this, the final moments were never easy. The door to the office opened, and Claire Parker walked in, her expression cold and unwavering. She was never one to back down, and Sam had no doubt that she wasn't here to congratulate them. "I just wanted to come by and say," Claire began, her voice cool but not unfriendly, "this case isn't over yet. You've exposed some truths, but that doesn't mean Hansen's going down without a fight." Clint smiled wryly. "I wouldn't expect anything less from you, Claire. You've got your work cut out for you, but let's see how the chips fall when the jury hears the whole story." Claire's eyes narrowed slightly. "Don't get too cocky. Hansen has connections you don't even know about. This may look like a victory for you now, but trust me, he's going to pull out all the stops." Clint chuckled softly, the sound almost a growl. That's exactly what I'm counting on. The harder he fights, the harder it'll be to pretend that the truth isn't staring him in the face. Sam couldn't help but appreciate Clint's confidence, but he knew they weren't out of the woods yet. Tomorrow's closing arguments would be the true test. They were all playing their final hands. As Claire left the room, Sam turned to Clint. Are we ready for tomorrow? Clint paused for a moment, his eyes locked onto Sam's. Then, with a slight smile, he nodded. We are, Clint said, his voice filled with quiet determination. Tomorrow, we finish this. And no matter what, we'll make sure the truth prevails. With that, Sam felt a sense of resolve settle within him. It was almost over. The war was nearly won. And with Clint at his side, he knew the truth would finally come to light. The next day, the courtroom was packed once again. The tension in the air was almost palpable as everyone knew the trial was nearing its conclusion. The final battle was about to begin. Would justice prevail, or would Hansen's empire continue to thrive under a veil of lies? Clint and Sam sat together at the defense table, ready for the closing arguments. Everything they had fought for was about to come to fruition. The stakes had never been higher. It was time to make their last stand. The courtroom was eerily quiet as the jury filed in and took their seats. It felt like the calm before the storm. Sam could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Everything they had fought for, the long nights, the late calls, the sleepless hours preparing the case, had all led to this. The final argument. The moment that would decide Robert Hansen's fate, and with it, the fate of countless lives that had been affected by his lies and manipulation. Clint sat beside him, calm as always, his eyes focused on the jury. He had a quiet confidence that Sam envied. He wasn't just prepared, he was ready. And that steadiness was exactly what they needed in this moment. Judge Graves entered the room, signaling for everyone to rise. He took his seat at the bench, and the proceedings began. Ms. Parker, you may begin with your closing statement, the judge said, his voice as steady as ever. Claire Parker stood up from her seat. Her polished, professional demeanor was on full display. There was no doubt she was a formidable opponent, but Sam could sense the pressure she was under. This was her last shot to sway the jury, and she knew it. Members of the jury, Claire began, her voice clear and firm, you have heard the evidence. You've listened to the testimonies. And most importantly, you've seen the character of the man standing before you, Robert Hansen. A man who, despite what Mr. Eastwood would like you to believe, has worked tirelessly to build a successful, legitimate business. A business that has supported families, provided jobs, and contributed to the community. She paused for effect, allowing her words to sink in. But what Mr. Eastwood wants you to forget is that sometimes, business decisions come with risks. And those risks sometimes result in mistakes. It is not a crime to make mistakes. We are all human, and we all falter. The truth is, Mr. Hansen made some miscalculations, but that does not make him guilty of the charges he stands accused of. There is no solid proof that Mr. Hansen was involved in the supposed conspiracy that has been so loudly claimed by the defense. Sam watched as Claire spoke. Her words were carefully chosen, meant to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of the jury. She painted Hansen as a man who had simply made some bad decisions, not a criminal mastermind. And yet, Sam knew that wasn't the truth. He had seen the evidence, he had seen how deep the corruption ran. Claire concluded her argument, her voice softening to a sympathetic tone. I ask you to look at the evidence with clear eyes. To remember that accusations alone do not constitute guilt. The prosecution has failed to prove that Robert Hansen is guilty of anything more than errors in judgment. And we all know that errors in judgment do not equate to criminal activity. She sat down, her gaze sweeping the jury. Sam felt his stomach churn. He knew it wasn't over yet, but it felt like the battle was tipping in her favor. It was Clint's turn now to take the stage. Clint stood up slowly, the calm confidence in his posture radiating through the courtroom. His eyes briefly met Sam's, and without a word, he walked toward the jury, pausing just a few feet from where they sat. His gaze swept over each one of them as if weighing their very souls. "Members of the jury," Clint began, his voice low and steady, "you've heard the defense's argument. They want you to believe that Robert Hansen made mistakes. That his actions were simply the result of poor decisions, poor judgment. But let me ask you this, how many mistakes does a man have to make before they stop being mistakes and start being a pattern? A pattern of deception, manipulation, and betrayal?" Clint paused, letting the question hang in the air for a moment, giving the jury time to reflect. He was methodical, precise. Robert Hansen didn't just make a few poor decisions. He crafted an empire of lies. A network of deceit that was built on the backs of those he exploited. The evidence we've presented to you shows just that. The emails, the testimony, the very nature of his business dealings. These are not the actions of a man who simply made a few bad choices. These are the actions of a man who intentionally set out to destroy others in order to protect his own wealth and power. Sam's heart pounded in his chest as Clint continued, his words slicing through the air with precision. "We've shown you the connections, the cover-ups, and the money trails that Robert Hansen tried to bury. He wanted to ensure that Mr. Green would never be heard, that his lies would remain hidden. But the truth doesn't stay hidden forever. And in this courtroom, the truth has come to light." Clint's eyes were now locked on the jury. His gaze was intense, unwavering. David Silverman, a senior partner at one of the most prestigious law firms in the country, admitted on this stand that he was part of the cover-up. He admitted to using his position to ensure that the truth about Hansen's company never came to light. He was complicit in this conspiracy. Clint's voice grew stronger, more impassioned. "But here's the most important thing I want you to remember, Silverman's words weren't just a confession. They were the final piece of the puzzle. A puzzle that showed not only Hansen's guilt, but also the lengths he was willing to go to protect himself." Clint stepped back slightly, his hand resting on the table as he addressed the jury one last time. "We live in a world where the truth is often buried beneath layers of lies and manipulation. But in this courtroom, the truth has been laid bare. And it's time to hold Robert Hansen accountable for the damage he has done. For the lives he has destroyed. For the trust he has shattered." He let the words linger, then turned toward the judge. "Your Honor," Clint said, his voice still calm but firm, "the evidence is clear. Robert Hansen is guilty of the crimes he has been charged with. And I ask that this court deliver justice, not just for Mr. Green, but for all the people who have suffered as a result of Hansen's greed." The courtroom fell silent once again. Sam could feel the tension in the air, the gravity of the moment weighing heavily on everyone in the room. Clint had delivered his final blow, and it had hit with the force of a sledgehammer. Judge Graves nodded solemnly and turned to the jury. "Members of the jury, you have heard both sides. The evidence has been presented. It is now up to you to deliberate and come to a decision. You are dismissed until further notice." The jury filed out of the room, their faces unreadable. The room felt as if it had emptied of air, the only sound the quiet shuffle of feet. Sam stood there, his heart still pounding. He knew they had done everything they could, but the waiting was the hardest part. Clint turned to him, his expression unreadable, but his voice steady. "We've done our part. Now, we wait." And so, they did. The next few hours felt like an eternity. Sam paced the office, running over every detail of the case in his mind. Had they done enough? Had they given the jury all the pieces they needed to make the right decision? The doubt gnawed at him, but Clint's unwavering confidence helped to steady his nerves. At last, the door to the courtroom opened. The jury was back. Sam's breath caught in his throat. This was it. The courtroom was packed to the brim as the jury returned. The hum of whispered conversations ceased immediately when the door opened, and the members of the jury filed back into the room. The tension was palpable. It felt as though everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting for the moment that would finally decide the fate of Robert Hansen, the man who had spent years weaving his empire of deceit. Sam stood beside Clint at the defense table, his hands gripping the edge with white-knuckled intensity. The air in the room seemed thicker than before. His mind replayed the closing arguments, the evidence, and everything that had led them to this moment. He tried to steady his racing thoughts, but it was impossible. This was the moment that could change everything. Judge Graves looked up from his bench and motioned for everyone to stand. The gavel hit with a resounding thud, signaling that the jury had reached a verdict. The room fell into a heavy silence, as if the entire building was holding its breath, waiting for the weight of the decision to be announced. "Mr. Foreman," Judge Graves said, addressing the jury, "has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman, an older man with graying hair, stood up slowly. His face was unreadable, but Sam could see the slight tension in his shoulders. This was it. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman said, his voice firm. He held up the piece of paper, the one that would change the course of their lives. The foreman cleared his throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Robert Hansen, guilty of all charges." The words hit like a thunderclap. The room exploded into chaos. A mixture of gasps, murmurs, and shocked expressions filled the air. Robert Hansen, who had been standing stoically at the defense table, was now visibly shaken. His face drained of color as the full weight of the verdict settled on him. For a moment, he stood frozen, as though he couldn't believe what had just happened. His empire was crumbling before his very eyes. Sam's heart raced. He couldn't believe it. They had done it. It wasn't over yet, of course, the sentencing was still to come, but the fact that the jury had returned a guilty verdict was a huge victory. After everything they had been through, after all the struggles, they had won. Clint stood there beside him, his expression unreadable, but there was a slight glint in his eye. It wasn't a look of triumph, but of quiet satisfaction. He knew the battle wasn't over yet, but this was a decisive moment. And Clint Eastwood, the genius attorney, had delivered on his promise. The judge called the room to order, his voice cutting through the noise. "Order in the court. We will proceed with the next steps in this case. Mr. Hansen, you will be remanded into custody pending sentencing. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning." The gavel struck once more, but the words felt distant as Sam tried to process what had just happened. His legs felt like they might give out from under him. It wasn't until Clint's hand rested on his shoulder that Sam realized he was still standing. "Well, Sam," Clint said quietly, "we've done what we came to do. Now, we just need to make sure that justice is carried out." Sam nodded, trying to keep his composure. He didn't know what the next steps would hold, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he could breathe. The battle wasn't over, but they had won the first fight. And that was enough. The next morning, the courtroom was filled with an air of somber finality. The prosecution and defense had both made their statements, but the true weight of the moment had already passed. The jury had spoken. Now, it was up to Judge Graves to decide the fate of Robert Hansen. Clint and Sam sat together in the defense seats, waiting for the judge to deliver his sentence. It was a strange kind of quiet. The air seemed heavy with anticipation, with a sense of finality hanging over them. Robert Hansen sat at the defense table, his usual composure gone. His once caring facade had cracked, and now he looked every bit the criminal he was. His eyes darted nervously around the room, but his lawyer, still standing by his side, offered him no comfort. Finally, Judge Graves stood and addressed the courtroom. His face was stern as always, but his tone carried a sense of authority and inevitability. "Mr. Hansen, you have been found guilty of multiple charges, including fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice," Judge Graves said, his voice calm but resolute. You have spent years deceiving the public and manipulating others for your own gain. The evidence presented in this court has been undeniable. You have shown a complete disregard for the law, for the truth, and for the people who trusted you. Hansen's face tightened as he listened, but he didn't speak. He knew that nothing he said now would change the outcome. I hereby sentence you to 15 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years, Judge Graves continued, his voice unwavering. This sentence is to serve as a reminder that no one is above the law. Your actions have caused irreparable harm to countless individuals, and justice will be served. The room was still for a moment before a wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. It was a sentence that seemed fitting, justice had been served, but there was still a sense of disbelief hanging in the air. Sam let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It was over. Robert Hansen would pay for his crimes. Clint's hand rested on Sam's shoulder again, but this time, the gesture felt different. It was a gesture of relief, a silent acknowledgement of the hard-fought victory they had just achieved together. As the courtroom began to empty, Clint and Sam made their way out, the buzz of conversation still echoing in their ears. Outside, the sun was shining brightly, and for the first time in a long while, Sam felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had been through a roller coaster of emotions over the past weeks, but now, it was finally over. The truth had won. Clint stopped just outside the courthouse and turned to Sam, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You did good, kid," Clint said, his gravelly voice carrying a hint of pride. "You held your ground, and you did your part. This was a win for both of us." Sam smiled, the weight of the world suddenly feeling much lighter. "We did it, Clint. We really did it." Clint nodded, his expression becoming more serious. "Yeah, we did. But remember, this is just one battle in a long war. There are always more fights to come." Sam looked up at Clint, his admiration for the man growing with every passing day. He had learned so much from Clint, not just about the law, but about the importance of standing up for what was right, no matter the odds. "Yeah," Sam said, his voice full of determination, "but I think we're ready for whatever comes next." Clint chuckled softly, a knowing glint in his eye. "You're damn right we are." The final battle had been won. But as Clint Eastwood and Sam Green walked out into the bright, new day, they both knew that this would not be the last time they fought for justice. The end was only the beginning. The aftermath of the trial hung in the air like a faint mist. It was almost surreal, after all the tension, the long nights, the grueling arguments, and the overwhelming uncertainty, it was finally over. Robert Hansen, once the pillar of the business community, was now behind bars, facing the consequences of his actions. And yet, Sam couldn't shake the feeling that something else lingered, something beyond the satisfaction of winning. Clint and Sam had gone their separate ways after the sentencing. Clint had his own plans, a few loose ends to tie up, but Sam, though grateful for the closure, was left with a feeling of restlessness. The weight of the victory hadn't quite sunk in, and now that it was over, he found himself reflecting on what it all meant. Back at his apartment that night, Sam sat on his couch, looking over the case files one last time. The light from the desk lamp cast long shadows across the room. Despite the victory, his thoughts kept drifting back to what Clint had said earlier, "This is just one battle in a long war." What did that mean for him? What was next? He thought about all the people whose lives had been touched by Hansen's deceit, the families, the employees, the investors who had lost everything. They hadn't just won a legal battle, they had given these people a chance to rebuild. But Sam knew that wasn't enough. He had been given a glimpse of what it meant to truly fight for justice, and it had ignited something in him, a desire to keep fighting, to keep searching for the truth no matter where it led. Clint's words echoed in his mind again, "There are always more fights to come." It was true. The world was full of corruption, greed, and deceit. People like Hansen weren't the exception, they were the rule. And Sam had realized, in that moment, that he could no longer stand on the sidelines. He had the knowledge, the skills, and the passion to make a difference. But what path would he take next? Just as these questions swirled in his mind, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Clint. Sam smiled as he read it. "Meet me at the diner in 15. We need to talk about the next case." Sam's heart skipped a beat. A new case. It seemed like Clint never stopped, always on the lookout for the next fight. And Sam realized, as he quickly grabbed his coat, that he was ready for whatever came next. He wasn't just a lawyer anymore, he was part of something bigger. A team, fighting for justice in a world that often seemed devoid of it. At the diner, Clint was already sitting in a booth, a coffee cup in hand. His gruff demeanor hadn't changed, but there was something different about him today. Maybe it was the relief of the trial's conclusion, or perhaps it was just the way he carried himself, like a man who had seen everything the world had to offer, both the good and the bad, and had made peace with it. "You look like you've got something on your mind," Clint said as Sam slid into the booth across from him. "Yeah, just thinking about what's next," Sam replied, his voice filled with uncertainty. "It feels like we've just wrapped up one thing, but there's always more out there, isn't there?" Clint took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Sam. "You're learning fast, kid. The fight never ends. There will always be people like Hansen, people who think they can get away with anything, just because they have power or money. But that's where we come in." Sam nodded slowly. "I get it. It's not about just winning a case, it's about making a difference. It's about fighting for the people who can't fight for themselves." Clint gave a rare smile, the first one Sam had seen in a long time. "Exactly. It's about giving a voice to the voiceless. But you've got to be prepared for what that means. It won't always be easy, and it sure as hell won't always be pretty. But if you're in this for the long haul, you've got to be willing to go the distance." Sam sat back in the booth, taking it all in. He'd learned so much from Clint, but this was the real lesson, the one that wasn't in any textbook or law manual. This was about the heart of it all. It was about making sure that justice wasn't just a word on paper, but something that could be felt in the lives of real people. "You've got the fire, Sam. I can see it," Clint continued, his voice steady. "But if you want to be a real lawyer, a real advocate for justice, you've got to keep that fire burning. And sometimes, that means going up against the toughest opponents, the ones who think they're untouchable." Sam felt a surge of determination. "I'm ready. Whatever it takes." Clint nodded, satisfied. "I know you are. And that's why I've got something for you." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a file, sliding it across the table toward Sam. "This is the next case. It's going to be big. Bigger than anything we've faced before." Sam's eyes widened as he looked at the file. The name on the cover was one he recognized from the news, Victor Trask, a billionaire tech mogul with a reputation for cutting corners and crushing anyone who stood in his way. He was one of the most powerful men in the world, and his company had been accused of everything from intellectual property theft to exploiting workers in third-world countries. "This guy?" Sam asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "He's untouchable." Clint leaned forward, his expression serious. "That's what they all think. But that's the problem. People like him think they can get away with anything because they have money, power, and influence. But we're going to show them that no one is above the law." Sam felt a rush of excitement. This was it. This was the real deal. The case that would define his career. And as he looked across the table at Clint, the mentor who had brought him this far, Sam knew that he was ready for the challenge. "Let's do it," Sam said, determination flooding his words. "Let's take him down." Clint smiled, his eyes gleaming with pride. "That's the spirit, kid. Now, let's get to work." As Sam left the diner, the weight of the new case settled on his shoulders. He was no longer just a lawyer trying to make a name for himself. He was part of something bigger. A team. A fight for justice. And as he looked up at the sky, he realized that this was only the beginning. The battle against people like Victor Trask would be long, and it would be hard. But Sam was ready. With Clint by his side, and the fire inside him burning brighter than ever, he knew that no challenge was too big. This was his purpose. This was what he was meant to do. And the war for justice had only just begun. The days after their meeting at the diner were filled with a sense of quiet determination. Sam had become more focused than ever before. The case against Victor Trask, a man whose wealth and influence seemed to stretch across continents, was unlike anything Sam had ever faced. His name was synonymous with power, and his reputation as a ruthless businessman who always got his way made him nearly untouchable. But Sam had learned from Clint that no one was truly above the law. As Sam sat in his office one evening, poring over the case files that Clint had handed him, the weight of the task ahead began to settle in. He stared at the glossy photos of Trask, taken at glamorous events, surrounded by people who adored him, his sharp jawline gleaming with confidence. On paper, he was the picture of success. But beneath that polished surface, there was a dark history, a string of accusations, lawsuits, and settlements that hinted at something much uglier. The most recent scandal, the one that had brought Trask to the public's attention again, was the exploitation of workers in one of his company's overseas factories. The conditions were appalling, workers toiling long hours in dangerous environments for pennies on the dollar, and Trask's company had been caught red-handed cutting corners, ignoring safety protocols, and bribing officials to sweep the issues under the rug. Sam's gut churned with anger as he read the accounts of the workers who had dared to speak out, only to be silenced by intimidation and fear of losing their jobs. But Clint had seen an opportunity. Trask had pushed his luck too far this time, and Sam knew that the key to this case lay not just in the facts, but in exposing the layers of corruption that shielded men like Trask from accountability. The next day, Sam and Clint met at the courthouse, the building looming over them like a giant. As they walked up the steps together, Clint's pace was deliberate, his expression unreadable. Sam couldn't help but notice the slight tension in Clint's shoulders. This case was a big one, and Clint knew it. For all his experience, even Clint Eastwood didn't take these battles lightly. "You ready for this?" Clint asked, glancing over at Sam. Sam nodded. "Ready as I'll ever be." Clint's eyes sparkled with a touch of pride, but his face remained as stoic as ever. "Good. But remember, it's not just about the law. It's about the story we tell. We need to expose Trask for who he really is. No one cares about the legal jargon. People care about the truth." Sam knew exactly what Clint meant. This wasn't just a case, it was a fight to expose the ugly underbelly of corporate greed. A fight to show the world that no matter how much money or power a person had, they couldn't escape justice forever. As they entered the courtroom, Sam felt the weight of the room settle around him. The prosecution was already seated, and the defense team, a group of sharp-dressed lawyers who clearly shared Trask's air of invincibility, sat on the opposite side. Their leader, a tall man with slick back hair and a cold expression, gave Clint a brief, dismissive glance. Clint didn't flinch. As the trial began, the tension was immediate. The prosecution presented their case, documents proving that Trask's company had falsified safety reports, testimony from whistleblowers who had worked in the factory, and a pile of evidence that painted a damning picture. The workers who had dared to speak out were on the stand, recounting their experiences in shaky voices. But Clint, as always, wasn't fazed by the pressure. He knew how to handle the spotlight. The defense team immediately began to downplay the significance of the evidence, attacking the credibility of the witnesses and suggesting that the entire issue was being blown out of proportion. Trask himself was never called to testify, he didn't need to be. He was above it all. His lawyers expertly deflected the focus away from him, making him the untouchable billionaire at the center of the storm. But Sam wasn't fooled. Behind the scenes, Clint had been gathering his own set of witnesses, workers from the factory who had been too afraid to speak out initially. People who knew the truth, people who could connect the dots and expose the system of corruption that Trask had put in place to cover up his dirty dealings. It was Clint's turn to speak. He stood in front of the jury, his gravelly voice filling the room as he addressed them directly. Sam watched as Clint effortlessly commanded their attention, his presence filling the space. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Clint began, "you've heard the story the prosecution has told. You've seen the evidence that paints a picture of a man who seems, on the surface, to be the epitome of success. But there is another story. A story that has been buried under layers of lies, bribery, and manipulation." Clint paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Sam could feel the atmosphere shift. Clint had a way of speaking that made everything seem personal, as if he were speaking directly to each individual in the room. "The truth is not always as simple as it seems," Clint continued. "Victor Trask built his empire on the backs of people who were too afraid to speak out. Workers who were crushed under the weight of his greed and ambition. But those workers have a voice now. And we will not allow them to be silenced." Sam's heart pounded as Clint went on, laying out the evidence of the cover-up, presenting the testimonies of the workers who had come forward, showing the jury exactly how Trask had manipulated the system. It was a powerful moment, and Sam couldn't help but feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. This was the moment when everything could change. As Clint finished his closing statement, the room was silent. The jury, who had been listening intently, exchanged glances, and for the first time, Sam could see the crack in the armor of Trask's defense. The billionaire, who had once seemed untouchable, now looked uncertain. His usually confident smirk had disappeared, replaced by an expression that betrayed a hint of fear. As the jury deliberated, Sam sat with Clint, waiting for the inevitable verdict. The minutes stretched on like hours, the tension building until it was almost unbearable. Then, finally, the jury returned. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked, his voice steady. The foreman stood, holding the paper with the decision. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Victor Trask, guilty of all charges." The room erupted in shock, gasps of disbelief filling the air. Trask's face turned white as he slumped in his seat, his lawyer staring at the jury in stunned silence. It was a victory, but it felt surreal. Sam's heart raced as Clint stood beside him, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. "You did it, kid," Clint said quietly, his voice full of pride. Sam could barely believe it. They had won. The fight against Victor Trask, the billionaire who thought he could get away with anything, had been won. But as they walked out of the courtroom, Clint's voice cut through the moment. "Remember, Sam," he said, "this battle may be over, but the war is far from finished. There's always another fight. And we'll keep fighting, no matter how long it takes." Sam nodded, his chest swelling with pride. He had found his purpose, and with Clint by his side, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. The journey was just beginning. The victory over Victor Trask was still fresh, but Sam couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, more to uncover, more to learn, and more to fight for. The courtroom's echo still lingered in his mind, the memory of the jury's verdict ringing like a bell, signifying not just the end of a case, but the beginning of something far greater. Clint had always said that there would be another fight, that the battle for justice never truly ended. And now Sam understood that better than ever. As the days passed, the press picked up the story, making headlines across the country. The verdict against Trask was a landmark moment, not just because of the man's wealth and influence, but because it showed the world that even the most powerful people could be held accountable. Sam, now known as one of the key players in the case, found himself thrust into the spotlight. Interviews, press conferences, and media attention followed. But despite the attention, he remained focused. This wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about something much bigger, the principle of justice and the responsibility he now carried. One late afternoon, after a full day of meetings, Sam found himself alone in his office, staring out the window. The weight of the world felt a little heavier now, but it wasn't the kind of weight that crushed you. It was the kind that propelled you forward, urging you to do more, to take on bigger challenges. Just then, his phone buzzed. It was Clint. "Meet me at the usual spot," the message read. "Got something to discuss." Sam didn't hesitate. Clint always had a way of making things sound urgent, and whenever he asked to meet, it was always for something significant. Sam grabbed his jacket and left the office. The diner Clint had chosen was their old standby, a place that was familiar and calm, a welcome contrast to the frenetic energy that had defined the days following the Trask trial. Sam found Clint already seated in their usual booth, a coffee cup in front of him. The old man's gaze was steady, though there was something different in his eyes, a flicker of something serious, something that Sam hadn't seen before. "You look like you've got something heavy on your mind," Sam said as he sat down. Clint leaned back in his seat, his fingers wrapped around the coffee cup. "You could say that. I've been thinking a lot about what comes next for you, for us." Sam raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Clint's expression softened for a moment before he spoke. "That win over Trask. It was big. But it's only a small piece of the puzzle. You've seen how the world works, how justice is too often a game played by the powerful. And we both know it's not just about winning cases, it's about making sure people like Trask don't get to keep playing the game." Sam nodded, understanding where Clint was going with this. "You're saying we need to do more. Not just fight one case at a time, but something bigger." "Exactly," Clint said. "I've been thinking about the bigger picture. We're not just going to sit back and wait for the next big case to come to us. We're going to take the fight to the people who think they can hide behind their money, their lawyers, their power." Sam sat up straighter, intrigued. "What are you thinking?" Clint's eyes gleamed, a fire igniting in them. "I want us to build something bigger, something that goes beyond just winning individual cases. A movement. A team of lawyers, investigators, and advocates who work together to expose corruption, fight for the voiceless, and bring justice to the places it's been forgotten." The idea hung in the air, a bold vision for what could be a revolutionary change in the legal landscape. Sam felt a surge of excitement and responsibility. Clint wasn't just offering him a job or a case. He was offering him a chance to change the world. "This could be huge," Sam said, his voice filled with awe. "But it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to be dangerous, too." Clint chuckled softly, a knowing glint in his eye. "When has anything worth doing ever been easy? But I'm telling you, Sam, we've got something here. You've got the talent, the drive, and the passion. And I've got the experience and connections. Together, we can build something that will make a real difference." Sam leaned back, processing the weight of what Clint was saying. This wasn't just about being a lawyer anymore. This was about fighting for a cause, for a movement that could change the course of justice. And it was something Sam was willing to put everything on the line for. "Let's do it," Sam said, a sense of determination building inside him. "I'm in. Let's build this." Clint smiled, the kind of smile that was rare but meaningful. "I knew you would be." The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Clint and Sam began reaching out to other like-minded individuals, people who shared their vision for a justice system that worked for everyone, not just the powerful. They sought out lawyers, investigators, journalists, and activists, people who had seen the cracks in the system and were ready to do something about it. But it wasn't just about recruiting people to their cause. It was about developing a strategy, finding a way to expose the deep-rooted corruption that ran through industries and governments. Clint had the wisdom to know that they couldn't win every fight, but they could create a movement, a force that would challenge the status quo. They called it the Vanguard Initiative. Their mission was simple: to fight corruption at every level, to seek out the truth, and to make sure that justice wasn't a privilege reserved for the rich and powerful, but a right for all. The Vanguard initiative quickly began to gain traction. With Clint's connections and Sam's growing reputation, they were able to build a network of supporters who were passionate about creating real change. They dug into the darker corners of business, politics, and society, exposing injustices that had been overlooked or intentionally buried. It was a long and difficult road ahead, but Sam had never been more certain of his path. The world was full of injustice, but with Clint by his side and a team of dedicated individuals, he knew they could make a real impact. As Sam sat in his office late one evening, looking at the papers in front of him, he felt a sense of clarity. The fight for justice was never going to be easy. But he wasn't alone. He had a team, a mentor, and a purpose. And that was all he needed to keep moving forward. The Vanguard initiative had just begun, and Sam knew that this was only the beginning of the fight. It had been several months since the formation of the Vanguard initiative, and Sam had never felt more alive, more focused, or more determined. Every day brought new challenges, new battles to fight. The fight for justice was never simple, and as Clint had warned him, it was often messy. But they had built something real, an organization that was starting to make waves, an organization that was taking on the powerful and the corrupt. Clint, though quieter now, seemed to be more content than ever. His wisdom, his unshakable calm, guided Sam and the team through some of their most difficult moments. But even Clint wasn't immune to the weight of the task they had undertaken. He had seen firsthand how the system could fight back, how those in power would do anything to protect themselves. But what Sam had come to realize was that the battle for justice was bigger than just one case, one movement, or one team. It was a war against a system that had been built to favor the few and ignore the many. And in this war, every victory mattered. The night started like any other. Sam sat at his desk in the office, going over legal briefs, making phone calls, and planning the next steps for the initiative. The office had become a second home, the walls lined with case files and maps of the battles they had won. But something in the air felt different tonight, as if the calm before a storm was settling in. Then the phone rang. Sam picked it up immediately, recognizing the number. "Clint," he said, his voice tight with anticipation. "Sam," Clint's voice came through, steady but with an edge that Sam recognized. "We've got a problem." The words sent a jolt through Sam's body. He leaned forward, a sense of urgency rising in his chest. "What happened?" "Victor Trask," Clint said, pausing. "He's back. And he's coming after us." Sam's heart skipped a beat. Trask had been the very first victory for the Vanguard initiative, but Clint's warning had been clear: people like Trask never truly go away. They may lose one battle, but they never stop fighting to protect their empire. "How?" Sam asked. "I thought he was done. We won the case." "We did. But Trask has deep pockets, and he doesn't take defeat lightly. He's made some moves in the shadows, Sam. He's been quietly rallying support. There's a lot more to his operation than we ever realized." Sam stood up, pacing in the small office. "What's he planning? What can we do?" "We've got to be prepared," Clint said, his voice unwavering. "I'll get some intel, but I need you to stay sharp. We can't let our guard down." Sam's mind raced. They had fought tooth and nail for justice, and now Trask was going to use every ounce of his power to turn the tables. The thought of facing him again, knowing how much influence and resources he had, made Sam's blood run cold. But there was one thing Sam had learned from Clint: never underestimate the power of the truth. And Trask's empire might be big, but it was built on lies. And lies, Sam knew, always had a way of crumbling. "I'll get the team together," Sam said. "We'll figure out what he's up to." Clint's tone softened slightly. "Be careful, Sam. Trask doesn't play by the rules. But I know you've got what it takes." Sam hung up the phone, his mind already calculating the next steps. The Vanguard initiative had never been about just fighting one battle. It was about taking on the system, piece by piece. And now, it seemed, Trask was determined to dismantle everything they had built. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, late-night meetings, and intense strategizing. Clint's network of contacts had provided crucial information. Trask had started moving money, laundering it through various international accounts, and using powerful lobbyists to influence local governments. It was clear that Trask wasn't done. He was plotting a return, and he was using his wealth and influence to protect himself. But Sam wasn't about to back down. He couldn't. The stakes had never been higher. Late one evening, Sam met with the core members of the Vanguard Initiative, lawyers, investigators, and advocates. They gathered around the table, the weight of the moment pressing down on each of them. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a war council. "We've got a real fight on our hands," Sam said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "Victor Trask is going to come after us. He's been laying low, but now he's making his move. We need to act fast and hit him where it hurts." One of the investigators, a sharp-minded woman named Ava, spoke up. "We've got a lead on one of Trask's offshore accounts. If we can prove he's laundering money, that could bring him down. But it's going to be difficult to trace the transactions." Sam nodded, feeling the weight of the situation. "We'll need all hands on deck. Ava, I want you and the rest of the team to dig into that account. See what you can uncover. We need to connect the dots." Clint, who had been sitting quietly, leaned forward. "And while they do that, we'll take care of the political side. Trask has his people in the right places. We need to expose them, one by one. If we can hit his political connections, we'll weaken his entire operation." Sam looked at Clint, the weight of his words settling on him. "You're right. We can't let him rebuild his empire." The room fell silent for a moment, everyone understanding the gravity of what they were facing. But Sam could see the resolve in their eyes. They had fought before, and they were ready to fight again. They weren't going to let Trask win. The next few weeks were a blur of action. The Vanguard Initiative worked tirelessly, using every tool at their disposal to uncover the truth about Trask's operations. Ava's team had uncovered a web of money transfers, bribes, and secret deals that reached into some of the highest levels of government. Clint's network had gathered intelligence on Trask's political allies, and Sam worked with the press to begin leaking small details, enough to make people start asking questions. But Sam knew it wasn't enough. Trask's empire was vast, and their work was only just beginning. And then, one night, they received the phone call that would change everything. Trask had made his move. He was coming after them, directly targeting the people involved in the Vanguard Initiative. And Sam knew that the storm they had been preparing for was finally here. They had no choice but to face it head-on. The fight for justice was far from over, and it was about to get even more dangerous. The storm had arrived. In the days following the phone call, the air around the Vanguard Initiative had thickened with tension. Every team member, from the seasoned lawyers to the young investigators, had begun to feel the weight of the battle. Sam felt it most of all, the palpable sense of uncertainty, the looming shadow of Victor Trask's empire coming back to life. Clint had always warned him that the system was rigged, that the fight was never easy. But now, Sam realized, it was more than a fight, it was a war. Every corner they turned, every new lead they uncovered, Trask seemed to be one step ahead. His power was vast, his influence far-reaching. The man who had once been brought to his knees in court now had the resources and the network to strike back in ways Sam hadn't even imagined. But it was one thing to be underestimated, and another to be defeated. Clint was unshakable, as usual. Even now, in the face of Trask's retaliation, he remained calm, his voice steady when they spoke. "We've been through worse, Sam. We've seen the darkest parts of the system. But that doesn't mean we'll stop fighting. We take it to him now. All of it." Sam nodded, determination setting in like a steel resolve. We're going to bring him down for good. But Clint's expression darkened slightly. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick. Trask has connections. He has the courts, he has law enforcement on his payroll. But what he doesn't have, what he'll never have, is the truth. Sam's heart thundered in his chest. He had spent countless hours in courtrooms, hearing stories of injustice, fighting for the underdog. And now, he had the opportunity to do something bigger than himself, something that could truly change the world. But it was a dangerous game, one where the stakes were life or death. Trask wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was a threat, a very real and powerful one. The team had gathered in their makeshift war room, the walls of their headquarters adorned with maps, pictures, and files. Ava and the investigators had done incredible work, connecting the dots between Trask's offshore accounts, his political connections, and even deeper, more insidious ties to organized crime. But the final blow had to come from within the very system that had allowed Trask to grow so powerful. They needed something concrete, something undeniable. And Sam had an idea of where to find it. I think it's time we go after his money, Sam said, his voice steady as he addressed the room. We've been digging into his finances, but I think the answer lies in his most recent project. He's been laundering funds through a real estate development deal on the outskirts of the city. Ava nodded, pulling up a map on the screen. The development's been getting a lot of attention. It's high profile, and there's talk of some major investors involved, some of them very close to Trask. Sam's eyes narrowed. Exactly. If we can prove the laundering operations connected to illegal activity, if we can tie it to Trask, then we've got him. We'll strip him of everything. Clint spoke up, his voice calm but sharp. And we need to make sure we're ready for his retaliation. He's not going to go down quietly. Expect everything from legal battles to direct threats. But if we have the right evidence, the right people on our side, there's nothing he can do to stop us. Sam turned to the group. We've come this far. We've exposed the cracks in the system. Now, we break through. The next few days felt like a blur. The team worked tirelessly, digging deeper into Trask's financial dealings, contacting whistleblowers, and gathering intel from every possible angle. The pressure mounted with each passing hour, as the knowledge that Trask was moving against them loomed larger. But even as the world around them seemed to close in, Sam found himself more resolute than ever. He had come this far, he wasn't going to let Trask destroy everything they had built. Then, late one night, Ava brought a breakthrough. We've got it, she said, her voice a mix of relief and excitement. I've found the transaction. Trask's development project isn't just about real estate. It's a front for money laundering. The funds are being funneled through a shell company connected to one of his high-ranking political allies. Sam's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the smoking gun. It was the evidence they had been searching for. But Sam knew that having the evidence wasn't enough. They had to make sure they could expose it in court, and fast. Clint's voice cut through the air. Now we take it to the press. We leak the information to the right people, get it out in the open, where Trask can't hide from it. He'll try to cover his tracks, but the public will demand answers. It's the only way to make sure he doesn't slip through our fingers. Sam nodded. We'll hit him where it hurts. We take him down in the court of public opinion, then we finish it in the courtroom. The media frenzy that followed was nothing short of explosive. The moment the first report hit the news, the story spread like wildfire. Trask's ties to organized crime, his money laundering operation, and his corrupt dealings with politicians became headline news. The public was outraged, demanding accountability from the very people who had been supposed to protect them. But Trask was not going to go down without a fight. His lawyers moved quickly, trying to discredit the information, threatening lawsuits against those who had published the leaks, and doing everything in their power to deflect the attention away from his guilt. But Clint had always taught Sam that the truth, no matter how hard it was to swallow, was the most powerful weapon they had. And as the weeks passed, the walls around Trask's empire began to crumble. People who had once supported him started to back away. Investigations were launched into his real estate project. And most importantly, the public was starting to demand answers. Sam and Clint sat in their office late one night, reviewing the latest developments. The battle was far from over, but they were closing in on Trask. "Do you think he's going to give up?" Sam asked, his eyes on the screen. Clint didn't answer immediately. He simply took a sip of his coffee, his gaze distant. "I've seen men like him before, Sam. They'll fight until they have nothing left. But in the end, they always fall. And when they do, it's not just the man who falls, it's the system that allowed him to rise in the first place." Sam let Clint's words sink in. It wasn't just about Trask anymore. It was about showing the world that the system could be changed, that people like him, like the Initiative, had the power to challenge the status quo. And as Sam looked at the horizon, he knew the final stand was coming. This wasn't just about taking down one man, it was about taking on the corruption that had allowed him to thrive. It was about a fight for justice, for a future where the powerful could no longer hide behind their wealth. Sam stood up from his chair, feeling the weight of the moment. "Let's finish this, Clint." Clint stood with him, his gaze steady and resolute. "Together, Sam. Let's take it to the top." The Vanguard Initiative had fought long and hard for justice. But the fight was far from over. This was the final stand, and they were ready to see it through. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?